Welcome to Whispers from History. Tonight, we invite you on a slow, quiet journey through one of the most complex and consequential stories in modern history, the life, rise, and fall of Adolf Hitler, told without urgency, without drama, and without judgment. This story is designed not to excite, but to ease your mind into rest. We'll begin in the quiet hills of Austria, where a boy named Adolf was born. From there, gently and carefully, we'll walk through the decades, through war, politics, speeches, tragedy, and collapse, until, in the silence of a Berlin bunker, the noise of one life comes to an end. This is not a story of glorification. This is a story of reflection. And like all of our stories, it's told slowly, softly, and with the hope that you might find sleep along the way. So settle in, close your eyes. Let's begin. Chapter 1: Early Life. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town in Austria-Hungary, near the German border. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, and his mother, Clara Hitler, was a gentle and devout woman who cared deeply for her children. The family was middle class, and the home environment was defined by the father's stern discipline and the mother's quiet devotion. Alois was considerably older than Clara and had a demanding nature. He expected order, obedience, and ambition from his children, and he often clashed with young Adolf, who was more sensitive and artistic than his father would have liked. Despite their disagreements, the household was stable in material terms, and Adolf received a standard education for the time. His early childhood was not extraordinary, and records describe him as an unremarkable student during these formative years. He enjoyed drawing, especially architectural scenes, and he developed a strong appreciation for German culture, even while living in Austria. This preference for German identity over Austrian citizenship would shape much of his worldview later in life. He had siblings, but only a few survived into adulthood, and the family experienced tragedy with the death of several children. Clara, in particular, doted on Adolf, especially after the deaths of other children, and this reinforced his attachment to her. As a child, he was often described as quiet but capable of deep emotions and intense reactions when upset. He developed a fondness for heroic Germanic stories and nationalist tales, which were common in schools and among the conservative culture in which he was raised. He also enjoyed reading, though not always academically. His early environment planted the seeds of identity, ambition, and resentment that would define his adult beliefs. Yet, at this stage, nothing indicated the future role he would play in world history. His experiences were personal and domestic, and his ambitions were still undefined. His academic record remained modest, and teachers found him both intelligent and obstinate, unwilling to conform to rigid structures unless they interested him. While his father wanted him to pursue a stable civil service career, Adolf dreamed of becoming an artist or architect, something his father dismissed. The tension between practical expectation and personal desire became a source of conflict at home. This tension persisted throughout his youth, particularly as he grew more independent in thought but remained financially and emotionally tethered to his family. The death of his father in 1903, when Adolf was 13, brought change to the household. Though the loss affected the family economically, it also removed the main source of authoritarian pressure from Adolf's daily life. However, this did not result in a turn toward discipline or ambition. Instead, his school performance declined. He failed to meet the expectations for a professional career and became increasingly detached from academic pursuits. By the age of 16, he had dropped out of formal schooling altogether and drifted toward personal interests, particularly art and the study of German history. His environment during this period included elements of both cultural pride and personal frustration. Though not politically active, he held strong opinions, even as a teenager, about language, ethnicity, and identity. These opinions were not yet coherent ideology, but rather a reflection of his social environment and personal experiences. The social atmosphere in the Austro-Hungarian Empire was complex and included tensions between different ethnic groups. Young Adolf internalized some of these views, though in a scattered and unsystematic way. His ambitions remained largely personal and undefined, shaped more by dreams than plans. He imagined himself as a future artist, but lacked the discipline and academic record to make that dream a reality through traditional means. In 1907, at the age of 18, Adolf Hitler left his hometown and traveled to Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His primary goal was to gain admission to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts, where he hoped to study painting and pursue a career as an artist. Confident in his talent, he submitted a portfolio of architectural drawings and waited for the results. However, he was rejected. The Academy's judges concluded that while he had some technical skill in architectural illustration, his work lacked the qualities necessary for professional training in fine art, especially in the human figure. This rejection was a significant personal blow. He applied again the following year but was denied once more. Despite these failures, Hitler chose to remain in Vienna. He had no formal employment and lived off a small orphan's pension and the money his mother sent him. In December 1907, his mother died of breast cancer, a devastating loss for him. With no close family left to support him and no formal education or qualifications, Hitler entered a period of poverty and isolation. He lived in men's hostels, shared shelters with the homeless, and scraped together money by painting postcards and small pictures for sale. His appearance during this time was unkempt, and he avoided close social ties. Though destitute, he remained intensely proud and avoided traditional labor, preferring to live frugally and pursue artistic dreams that no longer had practical hope. These years in Vienna were formative not only in terms of his personal hardships but also in terms of his worldview. While living in this multicultural metropolis, he began to develop a more defined sense of identity and social critique. Vienna at the time was a diverse city filled with people of various ethnic backgrounds, religions, and political beliefs. The late Habsburg Empire was marked by a mix of German Austrians, Czechs, Jews, Hungarians, Serbs, and many others living in close proximity. It was also a center of political debate, with competing ideologies ranging from socialism and Marxism to nationalism, pan-Germanism, and traditional monarchism. Hitler was a silent observer of these movements and did not participate actively in political life during these years, but he read widely, often in libraries, and absorbed material from newspapers and pamphlets. In these readings, he encountered nationalist and racial theories, some of which left a lasting impression. Though his anti-Semitism was not yet fully formed, he began to adopt the views expressed by pan-German nationalists who blamed Jews, Marxists, and liberal democracy for the decline of the German people. He also found resonance in the writings of figures such as George Ritter von Schauner and Karl Lueger, both of whom espoused racial nationalism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Lueger, in particular, was the mayor of Vienna and an influential populist figure who used anti-Jewish sentiment to gain political support. Hitler later acknowledged Lueger's skill in manipulating mass opinion as something he admired, even if he claimed to see through the substance of the man's ideology. During this period, Hitler also developed a strong dislike for the Habsburg monarchy and the multinational structure of the empire. He came to believe that the German people within Austria were being weakened and diluted by the presence and influence of other ethnic groups. This idea, though not unique to him, was deeply internalized and contributed to his belief in ethnic purity and national unity later in life. He believed that German-speaking peoples belonged together in a single national entity and resented the fragmentation of German identity in Austria. Despite these growing ideological convictions, Hitler did not engage with others to spread his views or organize politically. He remained socially isolated, keeping mostly to himself. His daily life was focused on survival, moving from shelter to shelter, and occasionally earning money through street art. He often stood in front of buildings, sketching, or selling small works to tourists. His appearance and habits became increasingly rigid and detached. He viewed the world around him with a mixture of disdain and fatalism, and he felt that society had failed to recognize his talent and worth. His pride remained intact, but he harbored growing resentment toward institutions and people he believed had denied him opportunity. These early disappointments in Vienna hardened his personality and contributed to a worldview in which he was the misunderstood victim of an unjust society. He also became increasingly focused on the idea of destiny, believing that he had a purpose, even if others could not yet see it. This belief in a personal mission would become a powerful driving force in his later years. His experience in Vienna ended in 1913, when he moved to Munich in Germany. He left Austria partly to avoid military service and partly because he no longer saw a future for himself in Vienna. By this time, his personal ideology had taken a clearer form. He was intensely nationalistic, held strong racial views, and believed that society needed strong leadership to prevent decline. These views were still personal and not yet part of any movement or political agenda. But the foundation had been laid. His failures as an artist, the loss of his mother, and years of living on the margins shaped a deeply alienated and bitter worldview. In Munich, he would soon face new circumstances that would shift his path from obscure vagabond to participant in world events. Yet in Vienna, the essential elements of that transformation had already begun to take root. In 1913, Adolf Hitler left Vienna and relocated to Munich, the capital of Bavaria in the German Empire. The reasons for his move were personal and political. On one hand, he sought a fresh start away from the city where his dreams of becoming an artist had collapsed. On the other hand, he wanted to escape compulsory military service in the Austro-Hungarian army, which he deeply resented. He considered himself culturally and ethnically German and felt no loyalty to the multinational Habsburg monarchy. In Munich, he lived modestly and continued to survive on what little money he had left, including the final remnants of his inheritance. He lived in rented rooms and continued painting small works for occasional income, though he remained largely disconnected from society. His ideological views solidified further during this time. He admired the German military and viewed the German Reich as the natural homeland for German-speaking people. His readings included German nationalist newspapers and tracts, and he consumed political content that reinforced his racial and nationalistic worldview. Still, at this point, he remained apolitical in terms of action. He was not a member of any organization, and he had no platform. His thoughts were private. His social circle was virtually non-existent, and his daily life remained simple and solitary. But history soon intervened. In August 1914, World War I broke out. Germany declared war on Russia and France, and the call to arms swept across the country. Hitler, now 25 years old, was elated by the news. He later claimed that he wept with joy in the streets upon hearing of the declaration of war. He immediately volunteered for service in the Bavarian army. Despite being an Austrian citizen, he was accepted, possibly due to a clerical error or lax standards in the rush to mobilize. He joined the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and was sent to the Western Front in France. His military service marked a dramatic shift in his life. For the first time, he was part of an organized structure with a sense of purpose, hierarchy, and camaraderie. He served as a messenger, a dangerous role that required moving between command posts under enemy fire. Though not promoted beyond the rank of corporal, he was considered a disciplined and courageous soldier by his comrades and superiors. He was wounded in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme and spent time recovering in a military hospital. He later returned to the front and was temporarily blinded in a mustard gas attack in 1918. Throughout the war, he was awarded both classes of the Iron Cross for bravery, a rare decoration for someone of his rank. These honors became a source of immense personal pride. He was never known to have close friendships in the military, and he remained somewhat of a loner, even within the regiment. But the experience of war had a profound effect on him. He later described World War I as the most formative period of his life. The structure and discipline of army life appealed to him, and the shared purpose gave him meaning. He also came to see the war as a test of national strength and moral will. The experience confirmed many of his pre-existing beliefs and intensified others. He saw the German soldier as a symbol of national purity and sacrifice. At the same time, he came to view the leadership of the German Empire and the civilian politicians back home as weak and indecisive. In his mind, Germany had not been defeated militarily on the battlefield but had been betrayed from within, a notion that would later evolve into the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. This belief held that socialists, Jews, and other internal enemies had undermined the war effort and caused Germany's defeat. Hitler adopted this view fervently. The end of the war in November 1918 was a crushing disappointment for him. Lying in a hospital bed after his gas injury, he learned of the armistice and Germany's surrender. The empire collapsed, the Kaiser abdicated, and a new republic was declared. Hitler experienced this moment as both a personal and national humiliation. He felt betrayed and directionless once again. He was discharged from the hospital and returned to Munich in a Germany that had changed entirely. The economy was in ruins, political unrest gripped the cities, and revolutionary movements were spreading. Hitler did not return to civilian life in the usual sense. Instead, he remained within a military environment. In 1919, still officially attached to the army, he was assigned to work in a propaganda unit. His task was to observe political groups and report on their activities. This assignment brought him into contact with nationalist and anti-communist circles. It was during this time that he first attended meetings of the German Workers' Party, DAP, a small right-wing group with nationalist and anti-Semitic leanings. He found their ideas aligned with his own and was soon invited to join. This moment marked the beginning of Hitler's political life. Though still obscure and inexperienced, he began to speak publicly and realized he had a talent for oratory. His speeches, charged with emotion and conviction, resonated with frustrated war veterans and others disillusioned by the new republic. The man who had failed as an artist, lived in poverty, and served as a common soldier was now beginning a new chapter. The trauma of war, combined with personal grievances and a sense of mission, propelled him onto a path that would soon change the course of history. But at the close of this first chapter of his life, Adolf Hitler remained an emerging figure, shaped by hardship, war, ideology, and a deep desire to belong to something greater than himself. Chapter 2: Youth and Vienna Years. Before Adolf Hitler moved to Munich and entered military service, his formative years in Vienna deeply shaped the man he would become. Although his early experiences in Braunau and Linz laid a basic emotional and cultural foundation, it was the city of Vienna that provided the complex and often harsh environment in which his emerging worldview matured. From 1907 to 1913, Hitler lived intermittently in Vienna, often under difficult conditions. His original purpose was simple: to study art and build a future as a painter. After the death of his father in 1903 and his mother in 1907, Hitler believed that a career in the arts would offer both personal fulfillment and public recognition. He had shown a moderate talent for drawing architectural forms, and he possessed a genuine appreciation for grand buildings, detailed facades, and classical symmetry. This fascination with structure and order would remain with him throughout his life. In 1907, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, submitting a portfolio of drawings. However, his application was rejected. The admissions board cited his poor performance in rendering the human form as the primary reason for rejection. He was advised that his skills might be better suited for architecture, a suggestion he took seriously but failed to act upon due to the lack of formal schooling. In 1908, he applied again and was rejected once more. This second rejection deeply wounded his pride. Rather than seeking alternative paths or revisiting his academic credentials, he began to withdraw from structured society altogether. He avoided friendships, ignored advice, and began to nurture a deep resentment toward the institutions and individuals who he believed had obstructed his path. Vienna itself, with its grandeur and cultural richness, became a paradox in his mind, both a source of inspiration and a symbol of exclusion. Despite his personal struggles, Hitler remained active as a self-taught artist. He produced hundreds of watercolors and pencil sketches, many of which depicted city scenes, buildings, and street views. Some of these he sold to small art dealers or directly to passers-by. The income was minimal, and he often lived on the edge of homelessness. He moved through cheap boarding houses and eventually public shelters. It was during this period that Hitler first experienced life on the absolute margins of society. These years of poverty created both practical challenges and emotional scars. Without stable income or prospects, he relied on public charity, slept in overcrowded dormitories, and often ate in soup kitchens. He lived among the poor, the unemployed, immigrants, and the sick. Though these experiences could have fostered empathy or solidarity, they instead deepened his alienation. He saw himself not as a fellow sufferer, but as someone fundamentally different from those around him. He believed that he had the talent and destiny to rise, but that society had failed to recognize or support him. This combination of pride and resentment became a core feature of his psychological profile. He viewed the social system as broken, dominated by people who lacked vision and corrupted by interests that worked against the well-being of the German people. In his reading and solitary reflection, Hitler began to develop a loose ideology built from various influences. He admired German nationalism and romanticized notions of a unified German people. He believed in hierarchy, strength, and cultural purity. He distrusted modernist trends in art, liberalism in politics, and the cosmopolitan culture of Vienna. He was particularly drawn to ideas that emphasized race, history, and national rebirth. Though he had no formal education in philosophy or politics, he consumed books and pamphlets that promoted these views. He read works by nationalist thinkers and paid attention to public figures who espoused radical opinions. One such influence was Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, who combined anti-Semitic rhetoric with populist politics. Lueger was known for his speeches that blamed Jews and liberal elites for the economic and social problems of the city. While some considered Lueger an opportunist who used prejudice for political gain, Hitler admired his ability to shape public opinion. Another figure he encountered through reading was George von Schauner, an early proponent of Pan-Germanism, who advocated for the unification of all German-speaking people and promoted exclusionary racial theories. These ideas, while widespread in the political atmosphere of Vienna, found particular resonance with Hitler's personal frustrations. He began to internalize a worldview in which the German people were being oppressed, their culture diluted, and their destiny stolen by forces both internal and external. His belief in a pure German identity began to merge with negative stereotypes of Jews, Slavs, and others. At this point, his anti-Semitism was evolving from vague prejudice into a more central component of his identity. It was not based on personal encounters or clear ideological training, but rather on cultural narratives and emotional projection. Jews, as a visible and often successful minority in Vienna, became for him a symbolic representation of everything he felt had rejected him. the elite, the modern, the liberal, the powerful. His anti-Semitism was as much emotional as it was ideological, rooted in frustration and envy rather than structured political theory. Despite these increasingly radical views, Hitler remained isolated. He did not join any political group, write publicly, or attempt to organize others. His thoughts remained internal, expressed only in occasional conversations and his reading choices. He continued to drift through the city, painting buildings, observing people, and fantasizing about a future in which his destiny would be fulfilled. His self-image became grandiose, shaped by a belief that he had been chosen for a special role. The city of Vienna, once a place of aspiration, became in his mind a symbol of decay, diversity, and corruption. By the time he left for Munich in 1913, Hitler had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. He had failed in his artistic ambitions, lost both of his parents, experienced poverty and homelessness, and absorbed radical ideas about race and nation. He departed Vienna not as a political activist or revolutionary, but as a man deeply convinced that the world was broken, and that he, perhaps alone, understood why. His beliefs were still unrefined, but they had taken root, and they would soon find expression in a different form once war arrived and history opened the door to his rise. Life in Vienna during the early 20th century was a complex and often contradictory experience, especially for someone like Adolf Hitler, who was navigating personal hardship, cultural aspiration, and growing ideological conviction. The city was a vibrant hub of intellectual activity, modern art, and political discourse, home to both the grandeur of imperial architecture and the discontent of the working class. It was within this layered and tense atmosphere that Hitler spent his most formative years. Although his life was marked by poverty and social isolation, he was an active observer of the world around him. His days were spent walking the city, sitting for hours in reading rooms and libraries, sketching the buildings he admired, and internalizing the tensions that defined Vienna. His surroundings, grand opera houses, parliament buildings, and coffee houses, presented the image of cultural richness, but beneath the surface lay economic hardship, ethnic friction, and political polarization. Hitler was drawn to these contrasts, and his personal narrative became shaped by them. He saw the culture of the city as increasingly decadent and disconnected from the ideals he associated with strength, order, and tradition. He viewed the multicultural nature of Vienna not as a strength, but as a sign of fragmentation and decay. For a man who identified so strongly with German culture and language, the presence of Slavs, Jews, Czechs, Hungarians, and others in positions of visibility and influence seemed to him like a distortion of what he considered a proper social order. This perception did not arise from rigorous political education or analysis, but rather from emotional reaction and selective observation. He began to see the world through a binary lens of strength versus weakness, purity versus corruption, order versus chaos. These categories were projected onto groups of people in ways that simplified the complexities of society into stark divisions. Jews, in particular, came to symbolize everything he disliked: modernism in art, liberalism in politics, internationalism in business, and perceived moral decline. While it is unclear when exactly Hitler's anti-Semitism became central to his worldview, it is evident that it intensified during this period. He would later claim that his transformation came suddenly, upon seeing Orthodox Jewish individuals in Vienna for the first time and being shocked by their appearance and customs. However, historians generally view this as a retrospective simplification. More likely, his prejudices developed gradually through reading and self-reinforcing beliefs. In Vienna, anti-Semitism was not a fringe idea. It was a regular part of public discourse, featured in newspapers, speeches, and political campaigns. Politicians like Karl Lueger used it to gain power among the lower middle classes, blaming Jews for economic competition and social instability. Hitler absorbed these messages and gave them emotional weight based on his own failures. His artistic rejection, his poverty, and his inability to integrate into mainstream society all needed explanations. Rather than seeing structural or personal reasons for these outcomes, he began to attribute blame to external groups, particularly Jews. He saw them not just as individuals but as a collective force working against the interests of the true German people. This thinking would later form the foundation of his racial ideology. His time in Vienna also deepened his interest in German nationalism and history. He read extensively on the unification of Germany, the legacy of Otto von Bismarck, and the defeats suffered during the Napoleonic Wars. These historical narratives, framed around ideas of national struggle and revival, gave him a sense of belonging and mission. He admired the idea of a strong, unified German Reich that placed cultural identity above class, ethnicity, or political ideology. He believed that the strength of a people was rooted in its racial and cultural purity, and he viewed the Habsburg Empire's multi-ethnic structure as weak and unsustainable. To him, the presence of different peoples within one state diluted national strength and prevented the emergence of true unity. He longed for a society in which German-speaking people formed the dominant and uncontested group, both politically and culturally. These beliefs were never challenged through open debate or intellectual engagement. Hitler rarely interacted with people who could have offered alternative views. He did not attend university, join intellectual circles, or engage in structured political activity. His education was self-directed and unbalanced, consisting largely of propaganda, pamphlets, and historical overviews written from nationalist perspectives. This narrowed the scope of his understanding and created an echo chamber in which his views became more rigid and self-confirming. In the absence of dialogue or structured criticism, his beliefs hardened into dogma. One of his few regular social activities was attending cheap theaters and operas, where he admired composers like Richard Wagner. Wagner's works, steeped in German mythology and heroism, appealed to Hitler's romanticism and nationalism. Wagner himself had expressed anti-Semitic views in his writings, and Hitler would later claim him as a spiritual influence. The themes of sacrifice, destiny, and cultural greatness resonated deeply with Hitler's personal identity. He did not simply enjoy the music. He connected it to his emerging belief in the special mission of the German people. Even though he remained a nobody in material terms, unemployed, without formal status, and isolated, he increasingly imagined himself as someone destined to lead. This sense of purpose, however unfounded or unearned, gave him psychological strength. It helped him endure poverty and humiliation because he believed that suffering was part of a greater plan. In his mind, he was being tested by fate, shaped for something larger than himself. This conviction was not grounded in reality, but it provided internal coherence. The image of Vienna as a city of lost greatness, corrupted by diversity and weakened by democracy, became symbolic of what he believed was happening to the German people more broadly. When he finally left Vienna in 1913, he did so not only as a failed artist and poor drifter, but as someone who carried with him a set of ideas that would define his life. These ideas, racial hierarchy, nationalist unity, cultural purity, and resentment toward liberal society, were the legacy of his time in the imperial capital. Though not yet a political figure, Hitler was no longer an ordinary man. His mind was filled with ideological purpose. His emotions were shaped by years of bitterness, and his self-image had been recast into that of a future savior of a struggling nation. By early 1913, Adolf Hitler's time in Vienna was coming to an end. He had spent several years drifting between shelters, living off modest income from watercolor paintings, and nurturing a growing ideological framework built on personal resentment and cultural observation. His life remained materially impoverished and socially isolated, but internally he had developed a clear, if deeply skewed, narrative about the world and his place within it. Though his art career had failed, and his daily existence was defined by deprivation, he had formed a powerful belief in his own potential and mission. With Vienna becoming, in his eyes, a symbol of moral and social decline, Hitler looked to Germany, specifically Munich, as a place where a different kind of society might be realized. His growing distaste for the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its multi-ethnic character pushed him to distance himself from it altogether. He no longer saw himself as Austrian. Instead, he considered himself a German in spirit and conviction, if not yet by citizenship. This sense of national identity was deeply emotional rather than legal or civic, rooted in language, culture, and imagined history. In May 1913, Hitler received a notice from the Austrian authorities ordering him to return to Linz for military service. This was not unexpected. He had already been delaying enlistment, but the letter forced him to act. Rather than comply, he decided to leave Austria entirely. Under the pretense of avoiding the draft, and perhaps also as part of a deeper desire to start anew, he left for Munich in the German Empire. He crossed the border without much difficulty and registered as a resident in early June. The move marked a significant transition in his life. Munich, a German city filled with Bavarian tradition and imperial pride, offered him a cleaner environment, a more culturally aligned population, and a more aesthetically ordered society than Vienna. Though still living modestly, he found the city more appealing, more German in his eyes. He lived in boarding houses and continued producing watercolors, some of which he sold to small dealers and shopkeepers. His financial circumstances remained difficult but manageable. For a time, his life in Munich was relatively uneventful. He continued to read voraciously, especially newspapers and political writings, and deepened his views on history, race, and nationalism. The atmosphere of Munich, more provincial and less cosmopolitan than Vienna, resonated with his worldview. It affirmed his growing belief that the future of the German people required unity, strength, and ideological clarity. During this time, he avoided direct involvement in politics, but he stayed informed. He observed the debates taking place across the German-speaking world about socialism, liberalism, monarchy, nationalism, and war. That he increasingly viewed politics as a battlefield, one where strong will and clear ideas would determine the fate of nations. He had not yet taken part in that battle, but he was preparing himself, intellectually and emotionally, for a role in it. His ideology, though still crude and self-constructed, was becoming more cohesive. He believed that Germany had a unique historical destiny, that its people were being weakened by internal enemies, and that only a total cultural and political renewal could save it. He saw strength and purity as virtues, while compromise and pluralism were signs of decay. He still had no structured political program and no institutional support, but his mind was filled with intense conviction. These beliefs were waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst arrived in the summer of 1914, when World War I broke out. Germany, as part of the Central Powers, entered the conflict alongside Austria-Hungary against a coalition of Allied powers. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had triggered a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations. Across Germany, men volunteered in large numbers, driven by patriotic fervor, romantic ideas of war, and a sense of historical duty. Adolf Hitler was among them. He reported to a local military post and requested permission to serve in the German army. Despite being an Austrian national, he was accepted into the Bavarian Reserve Infantry. The circumstances surrounding this enlistment remain somewhat unclear, but it appears that either through administrative oversight or wartime necessity, the authorities overlooked his nationality. For Hitler, this was not merely an opportunity to serve. It was, in his mind, a moment of personal vindication. He believed he was finally becoming part of something larger than himself, something noble and historical. The war would give him purpose, discipline, and a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. It was, as he would later write, the most transformative experience of his life. At that moment, the former failed art student and isolated ideologue became a soldier in the service of the German Empire. Though he would serve without distinction of rank, never rising above corporal, he would come to view this period not only as a personal turning point, but as the beginning of a national story that he was destined to help write. When he left Vienna, he had no plan, no profession, and no power. But by the time he marched to the front lines in Belgium and France, he carried within him a story, a cause, and a belief that fate had given him a role to play in the future of his people. The young man who had once wandered the streets of Vienna with his drawings and bitterness was now preparing to enter the greatest conflict the world had yet seen, a war that would not only change nations but set the conditions for his rise from obscurity to infamy. Chapter 3, World War I. When Adolf Hitler joined the German army in August 1914, he entered a world radically different from the artistic and ideological solitude he had known in Vienna and Munich. The military, with its order, hierarchy, and sense of collective identity, gave him a structured purpose he had never experienced before. Assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, also known as the List Regiment, Hitler became part of the mobilization that swept across Germany in a tide of patriotic enthusiasm. The early war months were filled with nationalistic fervor, as volunteers from all backgrounds rushed to enlist, many expecting a short and glorious campaign. Hitler, who had long idolized the military ideal and viewed war as a test of strength and national destiny, embraced this moment with emotional intensity. He would later write that he experienced the outbreak of war not with fear but with overwhelming joy, as if history had finally given his life a stage. As a common soldier, Hitler was trained quickly and sent to the Western Front. In October 1914, he saw combat for the first time near Ypres in Belgium, during what became known as the First Battle of Ypres. It was one of the war's bloodiest early engagements, marked by trench warfare, heavy artillery, and massive casualties. Hitler's regiment, like many others, suffered devastating losses. More than half of its men were killed or wounded within the first few weeks. Hitler survived and was quickly recognized by his superiors for his endurance, discipline, and willingness to carry out dangerous tasks. He was assigned the role of a regimental message runner, a position that required traveling between command posts, often under enemy fire. Though not a glamorous position, it was perilous and essential, and it allowed Hitler to remain close to the front without engaging in direct assaults. This role suited him. He was viewed as brave but solitary, dutiful but aloof. Unlike many soldiers who developed strong bonds with their comrades, Hitler kept his distance. He rarely participated in casual conversations or social activities, and many described him as odd or overly intense. He avoided alcohol and women, spent his free time sketching or reading newspapers, and often spoke in grand terms about history and destiny. His personality, shaped by years of isolation and inner conviction, remained largely unchanged by the camaraderie of military life. Nevertheless, the military structure gave him an identity and routine that he valued. For the first time, he belonged to an organization with clear rules, objectives, and rewards for discipline and loyalty. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and, later, the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, an honor rarely awarded to someone of his rank. The medal, which he wore with pride for the rest of his life, was a symbol of personal validation and recognition, something he had long been denied in civilian life. Life at the front, however, was far from romantic. Conditions were brutal. Soldiers lived in trenches filled with mud, lice, and rats. They endured freezing temperatures, relentless shelling, and the constant threat of death. The Western Front became a stalemate, defined by attrition rather than advancement. Soldiers experienced both physical hardship and psychological strain, with many suffering from what would later be identified as shell shock. Hitler, though never seriously wounded during the early years, was deeply affected by what he saw. The death and suffering around him reinforced his belief in sacrifice, struggle, and the cruelty of fate. He came to see war not only as a political instrument but as a purifying force, a crucible in which the strong would survive and the weak would be cast aside. This thinking aligned with social Darwinist ideas that were circulating at the time, which portrayed history as a struggle between competing races and nations. Hitler's political views, though still not fully developed into a cohesive ideology, continued to sharpen in the trenches. He blamed Germany's military setbacks not on strategic errors or the strength of the Allies, but on internal weakness. He distrusted the press, which he saw as defeatist, and grew increasingly hostile toward what he perceived as insufficient commitment to victory on the home front. He was particularly contemptuous of socialist and Marxist movements that called for peace or criticized the war effort. These movements, he believed, were undermining morale and dividing the German people at a time when unity was essential. He also intensified his belief that Jews were playing a harmful role in Germany's decline, although there is little evidence that he formed these views based on direct interactions with Jewish soldiers or officers. Rather, he drew upon stereotypes and narratives he had absorbed in Vienna and Munich. In the trenches, these beliefs merged with the suffering and confusion of war to form a simplified worldview in which external and internal enemies were conspiring to destroy Germany. The war became, for Hitler, not just a military conflict but a moral and ideological one, a struggle for the soul of the nation. Despite the violence and chaos around him, Hitler's letters and writings from the time show little empathy for civilian suffering or the broader human cost of the conflict. His focus remained on the idea of German honor and destiny. He saw the war as a test of character and as an opportunity to redeem both his personal worth and the nation's greatness. As the war dragged on into 1916 and 1917, Hitler continued to serve on the Western Front, participating in battles such as the Somme and Passchendaele. He was wounded in the leg during one engagement and spent time recovering in a military hospital, but he returned to duty as soon as he was able. His loyalty to the regiment and to the cause of German victory never wavered. He believed that defeat would be catastrophic, not just in military terms but in moral and cultural ones. As Germany's position weakened and domestic unrest grew, Hitler became increasingly convinced that betrayal from within was responsible for the looming collapse. These beliefs, hardened by years of trench warfare, would become the emotional and ideological bedrock of his post-war political message. As World War I entered its final year in 1918, Germany found itself in a precarious position. Despite early victories and a temporarily stabilized front, the Allied powers had grown stronger through the support of the United States, which had entered the war in 1917. Germany's resources were exhausted, its population demoralized, and its military increasingly overextended. On the Western Front, German forces launched one last major offensive in the spring of 1918, but it failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. By late summer, the tide of the war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allies began a coordinated counteroffensive, gradually reclaiming territory. At home, food shortages, strikes, and protests reflected the toll the war had taken on the civilian population. Morale was collapsing not just among civilians, but within the military itself. Desertions increased. Rumors of surrender circulated in the trenches. Soldiers began to question the purpose and value of the sacrifices they had made for 4 years. For Adolf Hitler, this turn of events was catastrophic, not only in strategic terms but in existential ones. He had dedicated himself entirely to the war effort, believing it to be both a national and personal crucible. The idea that Germany might lose the war was, to him, intolerable. He had framed the entire conflict as a moral battle for the survival of the German people. The possibility of defeat struck at the core of his emerging ideology. In October 1918, Hitler's war came to a sudden halt. During a British mustard gas attack near Ypres, he suffered temporary blindness and was evacuated to a military hospital in Pasewalk, a small town in northeastern Germany. There, surrounded by other wounded soldiers and isolated from the front, he learned of Germany's surrender. The news came gradually and then with finality. The Kaiser had abdicated, a republic had been declared, and the war was over. Hitler later wrote that he was stunned. For him, the armistice was not a military necessity but a betrayal. He refused to believe that the German army had been defeated in the field. Instead, he accepted and adopted a growing narrative that would become central to post-war nationalist rhetoric: the stab-in-the-back myth, or Volksdaslegende. This belief held that Germany's military had not lost to the Allied armies, but had been sabotaged by internal enemies, particularly Jews, Marxists, and liberal politicians, who had spread defeatism, led strikes, and ultimately overthrown the monarchy. The myth ignored military facts and strategic failures, but it offered a powerful emotional explanation for national collapse. Provided someone to blame, Hitler embraced this idea wholeheartedly. It aligned with the worldview he had been forming for years, that the German people were noble and strong, but had been weakened from within by corruption, cowardice, and racial impurity. The hospital experience in Pasewalk became, for him, a crucible of transformation. Blinded, physically weak, and emotionally devastated, he claimed to have experienced a kind of revelation, that his life had a mission beyond the battlefield. Though the historical accuracy of this revelation is debated, some believe it was later embellished to fit his narrative. What is clear is that Hitler left the hospital in November 1918 no longer just a defeated soldier, but a man seeking a cause. The collapse of the old order, the monarchy, the imperial military, the values of loyalty and sacrifice, left a vacuum that Hitler was desperate to fill. Returning to Munich, he found a city and a country in disarray. The monarchy had been replaced by a fragile and divided republic. Revolutionary councils, inspired by socialist and communist ideals, had sprung up in several cities. In Bavaria, where Munich was located, a short-lived socialist republic was declared in 1919. Armed militias roamed the streets. Violence between leftist revolutionaries and right-wing Freikorps militias became common. The atmosphere was one of confusion, fear, and ideological extremism. For Hitler, this chaos confirmed everything he already believed: that Germany was under siege not just from foreign enemies, but from within. His resentment turned into political rage. He saw the collapse of order as a betrayal of the soldiers who had fought and died in the trenches. The war, in his mind, had not ended. It had merely shifted forms, from the battlefield to the streets, from external enemies to internal traitors. Yet despite these intense emotions, Hitler still had no clear path forward. He was alone, unemployed, and uncertain about his future. He remained connected to the military in a loose administrative capacity, and it was this connection that opened a new door. In the spring of 1919, the German army, trying to monitor and influence political developments, began assigning certain soldiers to propaganda and intelligence tasks. Hitler was selected for one such unit. His job was to attend political meetings, report on subversive activity, and assist in efforts to re-educate soldiers away from socialist ideas. It was in this capacity that Hitler first encountered the German Workers' Party, DAP, a small nationalist group founded by Anton Drexler. The party was anti-Marxist, anti-Semitic, and pro-German unity, values that strongly aligned with Hitler's views. He attended one of their meetings in September 1919 and was struck by the weakness of their message delivery, but also by the potential of the ideas. He spoke at the meeting and impressed the party members with his passion and rhetorical skill. Soon after, Drexler invited him to join. At first, Hitler hesitated. He still thought of himself as a soldier, not a politician. But after reflection, he accepted. The moment marked a turning point. Hitler had found his stage. The years of solitude, war, loss, and resentment had prepared him for this transition. He brought to the party not just ideological commitment, but an unusual ability to speak, to persuade, and to dramatize. Though still obscure and unimportant in national terms, Hitler was beginning to assemble the pieces of a political career. The transformation from failed artist to frontline soldier was now shifting again, into the emergence of a political agitator with ambitions far beyond the walls of the small beer halls where he began. After returning to Munich in late 1918 following his discharge from the military hospital in Pasewalk, Adolf Hitler found himself in a Germany fundamentally transformed. The empire he had served no longer existed. The Kaiser had abdicated, the monarchy had collapsed, and a republic had taken its place. Veterans like Hitler returned to a society that did not greet them as heroes, but as burdens in a country grappling with political revolution, economic collapse, and social instability. Unemployment was widespread, inflation was rising, and political factions were vying for control. In Bavaria, where Hitler resided, the chaos was especially acute. The brief existence of the Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, followed by its violent suppression by right-wing paramilitary groups, further radicalized the political environment. It was a time of uncertainty and open ideological warfare. Amid this confusion, the German army sought to maintain influence by closely monitoring political developments. Military leaders feared a Bolshevik-style revolution and sought to counter leftist ideologies through propaganda and infiltration. Hitler, still nominally attached to the army, was assigned to the intelligence and education department of the Reichswehr, the post-imperial German military. His duties involved attending political meetings, writing reports, and helping shape ideological instruction for troops. He was tasked with identifying anti-German sentiments, socialist tendencies, and revolutionary groups. It was in this role that Hitler began attending meetings of small political organizations, many of which were nationalist or anti-communist in orientation. These assignments were initially clerical and observational, but they offered him exposure to the volatile world of post-war German politics. On September 12, 1919, he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or DAP, a tiny political group with only a few dozen members, founded by Anton Drexler, a locksmith and political activist. The DAP was a nationalist, anti-Marxist, and anti-Semitic organization that aimed to unify disaffected workers and veterans under a vision of German renewal. During the meeting, Hitler listened to a speaker criticize the idea of German unification with Austria, a position he found deeply offensive. He rose to respond, delivering an impromptu speech that sharply countered the speaker's argument. His passion and rhetorical skill caught the attention of Drexler and others in attendance. Drexler approached him afterward and encouraged him to join the party. At first, Hitler was hesitant. The group was small, poorly organized, and lacked direction. But he saw in it a vehicle for his own ideas. The party's themes aligned with his developing worldview: hatred of Marxism, resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, disdain for parliamentary democracy, and belief in ethnic nationalism. Moreover, Hitler recognized that the party lacked a powerful voice, someone who could draw crowds and communicate ideas effectively. He saw an opportunity to fill that role. After some consideration, he joined the DAP as its 55th member, receiving a membership card with the number 555. The party inflated its membership numbers to appear larger. His decision to join marked a fundamental shift in his life. From that moment forward, he would no longer be a passive observer of politics or a drifting veteran with unchanneled grievances. He was becoming a political actor, someone who would shape events rather than simply comment on them. Once inside the party, Hitler quickly asserted himself. He began speaking at meetings, writing pamphlets, and helping to shape the DA peace messaging. His oratorical talent stood out immediately. Unlike the dry, technical language used by many early party members, Hitler's speeches were emotional, direct, and dramatic. He knew how to tap into the frustrations of ordinary people, especially war veterans, workers, and the lower middle class. He spoke in vivid terms about national humiliation, betrayal, and the need for rebirth. He painted Germany's defeat in World War I not as a consequence of military failure, but as the result of treachery at home, by Jews, Marxists, and weak politicians. These themes, already circulating widely in right-wing circles, became central to his narrative. What distinguished Hitler was not the originality of his ideas, but the force with which he expressed them. His speeches, often held in beer halls and small public venues, began to attract attention. Audiences grew, donations increased, and the party started gaining new members. Hitler's energy and vision stood in contrast to the amateurishness of many early DAP leaders, and he gradually took on more responsibility. In 1920, he pushed the party to adopt a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or NSDAP. The name combined nationalist and socialist language in a way that was intentionally ambiguous, designed to attract both workers and conservatives. Around the same time, Hitler co-authored a 25-point party program that laid out the NSDAP's core positions. These included the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, demands for the unification of all Germans into one Reich, opposition to what they called foreign influence, the exclusion of Jews from German citizenship, and the nationalization of certain industries. The platform was a mix of radical nationalism, racial ideology, anti-capitalist rhetoric, and authoritarian goals. Though incoherent in places, it was emotionally compelling and well-matched to the mood of the time. Hitler's rapid ascent within the party continued. By 1921, he was effectively the face of the NSDAP and had assumed leadership of its direction and messaging. His transformation from an anonymous veteran to a rising political firebrand was nearly complete. The man who had once wandered the streets of Vienna selling postcards was now commanding attention from hundreds and soon thousands of Germans disillusioned with the present and longing for a return to greatness. While still a regional movement in Bavaria, the seeds of a national phenomenon had been planted. Hitler had found his voice, his platform, and his audience. What remained was to expand that influence beyond beer halls and bulletin boards, to turn a fringe movement into a mass party. The war had ended, but for Hitler, the real struggle, the camp, was only beginning. Chapter 4: Post-War Germany. The Germany that emerged from World War I was a country in crisis. Politically, economically, and socially, it was unrecognizable compared to the imperial state that had entered the war in 1914. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II in November 1918 marked the end of the German Empire and the beginning of the Weimar Republic, a fragile and experimental democracy born out of defeat, revolution, and necessity. For millions of Germans, the end of the war brought not peace but humiliation, chaos, and hardship. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, formalized Germany's defeat and imposed punitive conditions. These included the loss of territory, severe restrictions on the military, and reparations payments that strained the already devastated economy. Most humiliatingly, Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war. This clause, more than any other, became a rallying point for national resentment. For many veterans like Adolf Hitler, who had experienced the war firsthand and believed Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated, the treaty represented a grave injustice. They viewed it not only as an insult but as an existential threat to the German nation. At the same time, Germany's economy was spiraling out of control. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s destroyed the value of the German mark, wiping out savings and wages. In 1923, the exchange rate reached over 4 trillion marks to a single US dollar. People carried bundles of currency just to buy basic necessities. Middle-class families who had built security over generations saw their wealth vanish overnight. The working class, already radicalized by the war and economic collapse, turned increasingly to socialist and communist parties for answers. The political spectrum in Germany became deeply polarized. On the left, revolutionary Marxists sought to emulate the Russian Bolsheviks and overturn the capitalist system. On the right, nationalists and monarchists yearned for the restoration of pre-war order and blamed Jews, socialists, and liberals for Germany's defeat and decline. In this volatile environment, paramilitary groups flourished. Organizations like the Freikorps, composed of former soldiers and right-wing militants, engaged in street violence, assassinations, and the suppression of leftist uprisings. Left-wing movements, including the Spartacists and regional Soviet republics, were likewise armed and confrontational. The Weimar Republic, caught in the middle, lacked the strength and unity to establish stability. Its leaders were seen by many as illegitimate November criminals who had surrendered Germany in 1918 and accepted Versailles in 1919. This landscape proved fertile ground for fringe political movements, including the small but growing National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, led increasingly by Adolf Hitler. In Munich, where post-war instability was especially pronounced, the NSDAP gained support among veterans, lower middle-class citizens, and others disillusioned by economic collapse and national humiliation. Hitler, with his growing reputation as a powerful orator, began holding rallies that attracted larger and more enthusiastic crowds. He spoke of betrayal, of the need for national rebirth, and of a singular vision for Germany's future. He blamed the Jews, the communists, the democratic politicians, and the Versailles Treaty for all of Germany's problems. His speeches were theatrical and emotionally charged. He used repetition, symbolism, and carefully chosen language to evoke feelings of anger, pride, and unity. He did not simply deliver political arguments. He gave people a target for their rage and a promise of restored greatness. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, known as the Brown Shirts, was formed as the Nstab's paramilitary wing, tasked with protecting meetings, intimidating opponents, and creating a sense of power and discipline. They wore uniforms, marched in formation, and clashed regularly with communist groups in the streets. Their presence gave the party a militarized image that appealed to veterans and nationalists. Though still a regional force based in Bavaria, the NSDAP was beginning to distinguish itself from other right-wing groups through its energy, organization, and Hitler's leadership. In 1923, the party's momentum increased when France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, in response to missed reparations payments. This action, seen by many Germans as another national humiliation, intensified economic turmoil and fueled nationalist anger. Hitler and the NSDAP believed the time was ripe for action. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's recent March on Rome, in which fascists had seized power in Italy, Hitler began to consider a similar move in Germany. He envisioned a national uprising beginning in Bavaria and spreading northward, culminating in the overthrow of the Weimar government. This idea, fueled by ambition and perceived opportunity, would soon lead him to take his most dramatic and risky step yet. But before attempting a coup, Hitler worked to build alliances. He courted conservative nationalists, military figures, and regional politicians. He believed that, with the support of these groups, a swift seizure of power was possible. Among his goals was to win over General Erich Ludendorff, a revered World War I commander who had become involved in right-wing politics. Ludendorff's participation, Hitler believed, would lend legitimacy to their effort. These preparations marked a turning point for the NSDAP. The party was no longer content with rhetoric and propaganda. It was preparing for revolution. Yet despite Hitler's growing confidence and local popularity, he underestimated the resolve of the Weimar authorities and the complexity of German politics. The stage was set for confrontation, and within months, the NSDAP would go from a rising political movement to a criminal enterprise in the eyes of the state. But in that moment, as Hitler rallied his followers and declared that Germany's salvation required bold and immediate action, he believed that history was on his side. The years of frustration, defeat, and ideological formation were about to culminate in a direct challenge to the state itself. By the fall of 1923, Adolf Hitler believed the moment had arrived for bold action. The Weimar Republic was fragile, the economy was collapsing under hyperinflation, and political discontent was at its peak. In Bavaria, where the NSDAP had developed a strong base of support, many believed that a nationalist revolution could begin and spread throughout Germany. Hitler, drawing inspiration from Mussolini's successful march on Rome in 1922, began to envision a similar coup in Munich, a dramatic seizure of power that would launch him and his movement onto the national stage. He was convinced that Germany needed a savior and that he was destined to fill that role. His strategy focused on winning support from conservative elements in Bavaria, particularly within the military and local government. He attempted to forge alliances with prominent right-wing figures such as Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian State Commissioner, Colonel Hans Ritter von Caesar, the head of the Bavarian police, and General Otto von Lossow, commander of the Bavarian Reichswehr forces. These men were not Nazis, but they shared some of Hitler's nationalist concerns and were also critical of the central government in Berlin. Hitler believed that with their support, or at least their cooperation, he could take control of the Bavarian government and use it as a springboard to march on Berlin. However, the situation was more complicated than he assumed. Von Kahr and his associates were cautious, skeptical of Hitler's extremism, and committed to maintaining order. Despite ongoing conversations, they had not agreed to support a violent overthrow of the Republic. Hitler, impatient and fearing that his opportunity might slip away, decided to act without their consent. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler and a group of armed SA men stormed the Burgerbräukeller, a large beer hall in Munich where von Kahr was speaking to an audience of business and political leaders. Hitler fired a pistol into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had begun. He announced the formation of a new government and claimed that the Bavarian authorities had joined his cause. In the chaos, von Kahr, Caesar, and Lossow were held at gunpoint in a back room and pressured to publicly support the coup. Under duress, they appeared to comply. Outside, the SA and other Nazi units began occupying key government buildings, assuming that the Bavarian authorities would soon fall in line. But by the next morning, the situation had changed. Von Kahr and the others had quickly withdrawn their support once they were released and returned to their own positions of authority. The Bavarian government, backed by the police and army, moved to suppress the uprising. Hitler, still convinced that momentum and public support were on his side, led approximately 2,000 followers in a march through the streets of Munich. The goal was to reach the war ministry and take control of the military infrastructure. The marchers were met by armed police forces near the Feldherrn Hall, a historic monument in the city center. A brief but violent confrontation followed. Shots were fired. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. Hitler was thrown to the ground when a bullet struck the man marching next to him. His arm was dislocated in the fall, and in the confusion he fled the scene. The putsch had failed. Within 2 days, Hitler was arrested and charged with high treason. Other leaders of the NSDAP, including Rudolf Hess and Hermann Göring, were also taken into custody or forced into exile. The party was banned, its offices shut down, and its publications halted. For most political movements, this would have been the end. But for Hitler, the aftermath of the failed coup became a critical turning point. His trial, which began in February 1924, was widely covered in the German press and provided him with a national platform he had never before possessed. Although he was technically on trial for attempting to overthrow the government by force, he used the courtroom as a stage for propaganda. He delivered passionate speeches, portraying himself as a patriot and a visionary who had tried to save Germany from the betrayal and weakness of the Weimar system. His arguments resonated with many Germans who were disillusioned with the Republic. He admitted his actions but denied guilt, framing the putsch as a moral necessity. The court, while officially convicting him, treated him with surprising leniency. In April 1924, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, but he would serve only 9 months. His time in prison was comfortable by most standards. He had his own cell, was allowed visitors, and received food and gifts from supporters. More importantly, it gave him time to reflect on the failure of the putsch and to rethink his approach to power. During these months, Hitler concluded that violent revolution would not succeed. Instead, he would pursue a legal path to power using elections, propaganda, and mass mobilization. It was during this period that he dictated most of what would become Mein Kampf, his political manifesto and autobiography. Though rambling and inconsistent in places, Mein Kampf laid out his core beliefs: the racial hierarchy with Aryans at the top, the dangers of Jewish influence, the necessity of Lebensraum, living space, in the East, and the rejection of democracy in favor of a strong, singular leadership. It was part confession, part blueprint, and part warning. Though its early readership was limited, the ideas it contained would later serve as the ideological foundation of the Nazi state. When Hitler was released from Landsberg in December 1924, he returned to a political landscape that had changed. The Weimar Republic had stabilized somewhat. Inflation had been brought under control, and foreign investment was returning. But Hitler remained committed to his goals. The NSDAP was still banned, but he worked behind the scenes to rebuild it, using proxies and newly formed organizations. His time in prison had taught him patience. He would now pursue power not through force, but through persuasion and strategy. The failed putsch, though a humiliation in the moment, had made him a national figure and given him a mythology, the bold leader willing to risk everything for Germany. This image would become central to his rise. From the ashes of failure, Hitler emerged more determined, more focused, and more dangerous than ever before. Adolf Hitler's imprisonment in Landsberg prison following the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 marked not only a temporary pause in his political career, but also a turning point in the development of his strategy and ideology. Though sentenced to 5 years for high treason, he served just over 9 months, during which he was treated more like a visiting political celebrity than a criminal. The Bavarian authorities, many of whom shared his nationalist sympathies, allowed him considerable privileges. He had his own spacious cell, wore civilian clothes, received frequent visitors, and was allowed unlimited writing materials. This environment, far removed from the usual austerity of prison, provided Hitler with the opportunity to reflect, reorganize, and prepare for the next phase of his political journey. More importantly, it gave him the time and circumstances to compose his ideological opus, Mein Kampf, a sprawling 2-volume work that combined autobiography, racial theory, historical revisionism, and political blueprint. Though dictated rather than written, his fellow prisoner and loyal aide Rudolf Hess served as typist. Mein Kampf served as the clearest articulation of Hitler's worldview to date. The book opens with an account of his childhood, youth, and experiences in Vienna, framing his artistic failures and economic struggles in political and racial terms. He described his time in the trenches of World War I as a moment of personal awakening and recast the German defeat as a result of betrayal rather than battlefield weakness. But the core of Mein Kampf is its ideological content, which revolves around several key themes. First and foremost was race. Hitler argued that all of human history was a struggle between racial groups, with the so-called Aryan race being the highest expression of human civilization. He viewed Jews not as a religious or cultural group, but as a racial threat, an alien force working to undermine the strength and unity of the German Volk people. According to Hitler, Jews had infiltrated German society, corrupted its culture, manipulated its economy, and led Marxist movements that aimed to destroy national values. He claimed that they were responsible for everything from Germany's military defeat to its economic turmoil and moral decay. This racial anti-Semitism was not simply prejudice. It was foundational to his political vision. Second was the rejection of democracy. Hitler viewed parliamentary systems as weak, inefficient, and susceptible to manipulation by vested interests. He believed that Germany could only be restored through a strong, centralized authority led by a single visionary leader. In this model, leadership was not to be chosen through elections or party coalitions, but through will, strength, and destiny. He positioned himself as that leader, suggesting that he alone had the clarity and courage to guide Germany back to greatness. Third was the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler contended that Germany's survival depended on territorial expansion, particularly to the east. He believed that the German people were entitled to conquer land in Eastern Europe, especially in the Soviet Union, both to feed the nation and to provide room for its population to grow. This expansionist goal was presented as both natural and necessary, rooted in a pseudo-Darwinian logic that framed life as a competition between races. The Slavic peoples, according to Hitler, were inferior and could be displaced or subordinated. Russia, in his view, was a Jewish-led state that needed to be destroyed. Mein Kampf was not widely read at the time of its publication in 1925, Volume 1, and 1926, Volume 2. But its contents were clear and unambiguous. Many dismissed it as a rambling manifesto by a failed revolutionary, but for those who paid attention, it outlined a program of extraordinary violence and ambition. Hitler made no effort to disguise his intentions. He framed them as destiny, and himself as the chosen instrument of history. Outside of prison, political conditions in Germany were beginning to stabilize. The Dawes Plan, signed in 1924, restructured reparations payments and helped restore some measure of economic confidence. Foreign investment began to flow back into the country, and the Weimar government appeared to have survived its early crises. Inflation was brought under control, and Germany was even admitted into the League of Nations in 1926. This relative calm made Hitler's return to political life more difficult in the short term. When he was released from prison in December 1924, the Nazi Party remained banned, its leaders scattered, and its reputation damaged by the failed coup. However, Hitler was undeterred. If anything, the events of the past year had deepened his resolve. He now understood that seizing power through violence was unlikely to succeed. Instead, he would exploit the very system he claimed to despise, parliamentary democracy. He would turn the mechanisms of the Weimar Republic against itself, using elections, propaganda, and public fear to build a legitimate path to dictatorship. This shift in strategy did not mean moderation, it meant patience. Hitler began rebuilding the NSDAP through front organizations and informal networks while negotiating with Bavarian authorities to lift the party ban. He restructured the organization with himself at its absolute center, demanding loyalty and obedience from all members. He appointed key figures who would become central to the Nazi rise: Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and others. Propaganda became a central focus. Hitler understood that emotional messaging, symbols, and public spectacle were more effective than policy papers or political debate. He cultivated the image of the Nazi Party as a movement rather than a traditional political entity, a cause rather than a coalition. The swastika, the salute, the mass rallies, and the myth of the movement all served to reinforce this image. Slowly, through relentless messaging and public appearances, Hitler began to rehabilitate both his image and that of the party. By 1927, the ban on the NSDAP had been lifted, and the party officially reformed. Although its national appeal remained limited, it had regained its footing in Bavaria and parts of southern Germany. Its ideas, once considered fringe or fanatical, began to resonate more deeply with segments of the population disillusioned with liberal democracy and fearful of economic instability. Hitler emerged from this period more dangerous than ever. He was no longer an impatient revolutionary, but a calculating political strategist. His time in Landsberg had transformed his tactics, not his goals. He still sought the total reorganization of German society, the elimination of what he called foreign elements, and the conquest of Eastern Europe. But now he would pursue those ends through speeches, elections, and mass mobilization, until the moment came to take power entirely. The lessons of failure had not humbled him. They had only taught him how to win. Chapter 5: NSDAP and Rise. When Adolf Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in December 1924, he returned to a political landscape that had shifted considerably. The Weimar Republic, though still fragile, had entered a period of relative stabilization. The German economy was showing signs of recovery, due in part to the Dawes Plan, which eased reparations and brought in foreign loans. Political violence had declined, and extremist movements, both left and right, had lost momentum. For Hitler and the NSDAP, this presented a challenge. The revolutionary fervor that had fueled their rise prior to the beer hall putsch had cooled. Many Germans, exhausted by years of instability, were beginning to accept the Republic as a necessary reality. Yet Hitler remained undeterred. He had learned during his imprisonment that power in Germany could not be seized through force alone. The failed putsch had shown him that the state was too strong, the army too loyal, and the public too divided to support a coup. Instead, he would focus on building a legitimate political machine, one that could infiltrate the democratic system and eventually overturn it from within. The first step was rebuilding the Nazi Party, which had been banned after the failed coup. Using a front organization called the German Freedom Party, Hitler and his associates maintained contact with their base while negotiating with Bavarian authorities. By February 1925, the ban was lifted, and the NSDAP was officially refounded at a public meeting in Munich. Hitler took full control, declaring himself Führer or leader, and establishing a rigid, hierarchical structure that concentrated authority entirely in his hands. The new party was not a traditional political organization. It was a movement built around loyalty, symbolism, and emotion. From the start, Hitler emphasized discipline and unity. He reorganized the party along paramilitary lines, creating overlapping networks of propaganda, security, and recruitment. The Sturmabteilung, SA, or stormtroopers, continued to serve as the party's muscle, engaging in street battles with communists and intimidating opponents. Though originally composed mostly of ex-soldiers and rowdy nationalists, the SA expanded rapidly, drawing unemployed youth, veterans, and lower-middle-class men frustrated by economic stagnation and social change. Hitler also introduced the Schutzstaffel SS in 1925, initially as a small personal bodyguard unit. Though insignificant at first, the SS would later evolve into a powerful, elite force loyal only to Hitler himself. Organizationally, Hitler placed trusted allies in key positions. Gregor Strasser, a skilled organizer and propagandist, was tasked with building the party's northern wing. Joseph Goebbels, who would later become Minister of Propaganda, was still relatively unknown but already showing signs of rhetorical brilliance. These men, though ambitious in their own right, accepted Hitler's total authority. Dissent was discouraged, and loyalty was rewarded. The party's message remained consistent. Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies, Marxists, Jews, and weak democratic politicians. Only a strong, unified state could restore national greatness. Hitler's speeches continued to focus on themes of humiliation, vengeance, and rebirth. He rarely offered detailed policy proposals. Instead, he appealed to emotions: anger, pride, fear, and hope. His style was theatrical and hypnotic. He knew how to read a crowd, how to pause for effect, how to raise and lower his voice with dramatic precision. For many, his speeches were less about content than performance. They felt that he understood their pain, spoke their frustrations, and promised redemption. Then Stap's propaganda machine was also expanding. Party newspapers, pamphlets, posters, and banners flooded public spaces. The swastika, adopted as the party's official symbol, became instantly recognizable. Its stark lines and association with ancient Aryan identity gave it a mythical quality. Hitler understood the power of visuals, repetition, and spectacle. Rallies were carefully choreographed events, filled with music, uniforms, torches, and orchestrated chants. These gatherings were not simply political. They were designed to evoke a sense of belonging, purpose, and sacred mission. While the party's roots were strongest in Bavaria, Hitler aimed to transform the NSDAP into a national movement. This meant expanding into Protestant northern Germany, where nationalist sentiment was high but party infrastructure was weak. Gregor Strasser played a crucial role in this effort, building local branches and adapting the party's message to appeal to regional concerns. Though tensions sometimes emerged between the more socialist-leaning northern Nazis and the conservative southern wing led by Hitler, these were kept under control through Hitler's insistence on absolute leadership. Elections during this period yielded modest results. In the 1928 Reichstag election, the NSDAP received only 2.6% of the vote, far behind mainstream parties. But Hitler was playing a long game. He understood that public opinion could shift rapidly, especially in times of crisis. He focused not on immediate victories, but on building an organization that could respond when conditions changed. That change began to emerge with the onset of the global economic crisis in 1929. The Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the international financial system, and Germany, heavily dependent on American loans, was particularly vulnerable. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, and unemployment skyrocketed. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were out of work. The fragile stability of the Weimar Republic disintegrated almost overnight. In this environment, then Stap's message suddenly found mass resonance. The themes of betrayal, national humiliation, and the need for radical change no longer seemed extreme. They seemed timely. The party's infrastructure, carefully built over the previous years, allowed it to capitalize quickly on the crisis. Membership surged, donations increased, and Hitler's public appearances drew tens of thousands. He was no longer seen as a fringe figure from the Bavarian underground. He was becoming a national voice of opposition. What distinguished the NSDAP during this period was its dual strategy. On the one hand, it presented itself as a revolutionary movement that rejected the Weimar system. On the other, it participated in that system, running in elections and campaigning like a conventional party. This paradox allowed it to appeal to a broad range of supporters: radicals who wanted revolution, conservatives who wanted order, workers who wanted jobs, and nationalists who wanted pride. Hitler was the unifying figure among these disparate groups. His image, crafted through speeches, posters, and staged events, was that of the singular leader who could rise above party politics and restore Germany's greatness. This cult of personality became central to the Nazi appeal. By the end of the decade, the party was no longer just rebuilding. It was on the verge of national relevance. What began as a small, obscure movement in Munich had become a political force preparing to challenge the very foundations of the Weimar Republic. Hitler's patience, discipline, and vision were beginning to bear fruit. The next phase of his rise would not be fought in the streets but at the ballot box, where he would come closer than ever to the power he had long sought. The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 dramatically altered the political landscape of Germany and served as the catalyst that propelled the Nazi Party from the margins of national life to the center of political power. In the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, Germany's fragile economy collapsed. Banks failed, industry contracted, and unemployment surged to unprecedented levels. By 1932, nearly one-third of the working population was jobless. Families lost their homes, businesses went bankrupt, and lines for bread and coal became common scenes in both urban and rural communities. The democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic, already regarded with suspicion by many Germans, appeared paralyzed and ineffective in the face of the crisis. Traditional parties could not form stable coalitions, and successive governments struggled to pass meaningful legislation. The despair and confusion created a hunger for alternatives, parties and leaders who promised certainty, order, and solutions. Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP, having spent years building a highly organized political machine and cultivating a message tailored to national resentment, were uniquely positioned to exploit this moment. The party's core themes, anti-communism, national renewal, racial unity, and the restoration of German greatness, now resonated far beyond their original base. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, flooded the country with posters, leaflets, speeches, and newspapers. The messaging was simple and emotional. Germany had been betrayed, democracy was weak, and only Hitler could save the nation. The image of Hitler as a savior was carefully constructed. He was portrayed as a man of destiny, a selfless leader above partisan politics, someone who had endured hardship, understood the common people, and would fight for Germany with unwavering determination. His biography, though manipulated, was used to build credibility. The soldier who had never surrendered, the man who had suffered poverty, the visionary who had predicted Germany's decline and offered a path to redemption. The party also diversified its appeal. To workers, it promised jobs and a revival of national industry. To farmers, it offered protection from debt and falling prices. To the middle class, it promised security, order, and relief from socialist agitation. To nationalists and conservatives, it vowed to undo the Treaty of Versailles and restore military strength. Though many of these promises were vague or contradictory, the emotional force behind them was strong. The Nazis were not just a party, they were a movement. This momentum translated into dramatic electoral gains. In the Reichstag elections of September 1930, the NSDAP increased its vote share from 2.6% in 1928 to 18.3%, winning 107 seats and becoming the second largest party in parliament. The results stunned the political establishment and announced the arrival of Hitler as a national figure. Over the next 2 years, the party continued to expand. Mass rallies drew tens of thousands. Hitler traveled across the country by plane, an innovation in campaigning at the time, giving speeches in cities and villages alike. His appearances were carefully choreographed events designed to inspire awe, unity, and discipline. Uniformed SA members lined the streets, music played, flags waved, and torchlight illuminated the night. For many attendees, these gatherings were transformative. They provided not only political engagement but a sense of belonging and hope. Meanwhile, the existing government was losing legitimacy. Chancellors Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher all failed to stabilize the republic. Brüning's deflationary policies deepened the depression. Papen dissolved the Reichstag to weaken the left but inadvertently strengthen the Nazis. Schleicher, caught between rival factions, lacked support and authority. These failures created a power vacuum at the very top of the state, one that Hitler aimed to fill. In 1932, Hitler ran for president of Germany against the incumbent Paul von Hindenburg, a revered war hero who embodied the old order. Though Hitler lost, receiving 36.8% of the vote in the runoff compared to Hindenburg's 53%, the campaign was a triumph in symbolic terms. Hitler had emerged as the most dynamic and popular political figure in the country. His speeches, posters, and slogans had reached every corner of Germany. He had become a household name, a man both feared and admired. The Nazi vote continued to grow. In the July 1932 Reichstag elections, the NSDAP won 37.3% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the parliament with 230 seats. Though they did not have an outright majority, their dominance was clear. Hitler now demanded the position of chancellor, arguing that as leader of the largest party, he had a democratic mandate. However, Hindenburg remained reluctant. He distrusted Hitler personally and viewed him as a vulgar demagogue. Instead, he appointed Papen and then Schleicher as chancellors in succession, both of whom failed to form stable governments. The Reichstag became increasingly dysfunctional, with repeated dissolutions and new elections. The Nazis used their strength in parliament to block legislation and deepen the sense of political paralysis. Behind the scenes, negotiations intensified. A group of conservative elites, businessmen, military officers, aristocrats, began to see Hitler not just as a threat, but as a potential ally. They believed they could control him, use his popularity to stabilize the country, and then marginalize him. Papen, in particular, played a key role in this shift. He believed that by offering Hitler the chancellorship in a cabinet dominated by conservatives, the Nazis could be brought into the system and tamed. Hitler, aware of these calculations, agreed. He had no intention of being a figurehead, but he understood the value of gaining power legally and then transforming that power into something absolute. After weeks of maneuvering, President Hindenburg, under pressure from Papen and other advisors, reluctantly agreed. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that marked the end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of a new era. For Hitler, it was the culmination of years of struggle, discipline, and political strategy. He had risen from a failed art student and fringe agitator to the head of government in one of Europe's most powerful nations, not through revolution, but through the ballot box and the backroom deal. But for Germany, it was the beginning of something far darker. The legal path to power would soon give way to dictatorship, and the promises of national revival would be fulfilled through repression, violence, and war. Hitler had arrived not as a usurper, but as a chancellor. What he would do with that office would change the world. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, many within the German political and social elite believed they had outmaneuvered him. President Paul von Hindenburg had reluctantly agreed to the appointment, persuaded by Franz von Papen and other conservative advisors who thought Hitler could be boxed in within a cabinet dominated by traditional nationalists. At the time of his appointment, only 3 out of 11 ministers in the new cabinet were Nazis. The others, including von Papen himself as vice-chancellor, came from the old conservative establishment. It appeared, at least on the surface, that Hitler had been granted power, but not full control. What they failed to recognize was that Hitler was not interested in compromise, and he had no intention of remaining a junior partner in government. From the moment he took office, he began working systematically to dismantle the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic and consolidate his personal authority. The opportunity to accelerate this process came less than a month later, on February 27, 1933, when the Reichstag building in Berlin was set on fire. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene, and the Nazis immediately seized upon the incident as evidence of a supposed communist plot to overthrow the government. Though historians continue to debate whether the Nazis orchestrated or merely exploited the fire, the effect was immediate and profound. The next day, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. Officially, the Decree for the Protection of People and State. This emergency decree suspended key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, press, and assembly, and allowed for the arrest of political opponents without specific charges. The decree effectively nullified constitutional protections and gave the government vast powers to suppress dissent. Using the authority granted by the decree, the Nazi regime launched a nationwide crackdown on communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other perceived enemies. Thousands were arrested, newspapers were shut down, and opposition meetings were banned. The climate of fear and intimidation made it nearly impossible for non-Nazi parties to campaign effectively. Just days after the fire, on March 5, 1933, Germany held new Reichstag elections. While the Nazis did not achieve an outright majority, winning 43.9% of the vote, they were now the dominant party, and with the support of their nationalist allies, the DNVP, they secured a working majority in parliament. This success gave Hitler the political momentum he needed for the next phase of his plan. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag convened in the Kroll Opera House under heavy SS and SA Guard to vote on the Enabling Act, a law that would give Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag or the president. Officially titled the Law to Remedy the Distress of People in Reich, the act required a two-thirds majority to pass, since it effectively amended the Weimar Constitution. Through a combination of political pressure, backroom deals, and intimidation, including the absence or arrest of many communist deputies, the act was passed with overwhelming support. Only the Social Democrats opposed it. The rest either supported or abstained under duress. With the Enabling Act in place, Hitler now had the legal authority to govern by decree. It was the formal end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of the Nazi dictatorship. Over the following months, Hitler moved swiftly to eliminate all remaining sources of opposition and consolidate total control over German society. The process, known as Gleichschaltung or coordination, involved the systematic absorption or destruction of all independent institutions. State governments were brought under Nazi control. Civil service laws purged Jews and political opponents from government positions. Trade unions were abolished and replaced with the German Labor Front. All other political parties were banned, and by July 1933, the NSDAP was declared the only legal party in Germany. The media was brought under strict censorship, with newspapers, radio, and film subjected to centralized propaganda control under Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The education system was restructured to reflect Nazi ideology, emphasizing obedience, racial theory, and loyalty to the Führer. Cultural organizations were purged of non-Aryan influence, and artists, writers, and intellectuals were forced to conform or flee. One of Hitler's key tools in securing obedience was the creation of a climate of fear. The SA, now numbering in the millions, patrolled the streets, enforced party discipline, and intimidated potential dissenters. In 1933, the first concentration camp was opened at Dachau, initially intended for political prisoners. It was presented as a means of protecting the public from communists and criminals, but it soon became a model for the vast camp system that would follow. While the SA had been instrumental in the Nazis' rise to power, by mid-1934, Hitler came to view its leadership, particularly Ernst Röhm, as a threat to his authority. Röhm had radical ambitions for a second revolution that would transform the social structure of Germany and integrate the SA into the army, an idea Hitler feared would alienate the conservative military elite. To resolve the tension, Hitler authorized a purge of the SA leadership in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. Rome and dozens of other SA leaders were arrested and executed without trial. The purge also targeted political rivals and critics outside the SA. The action won the approval of the German army, which pledged its loyalty to Hitler personally soon after. With the death of President Hindenburg on August 2, 1934, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Chancellor of the Reich. A public referendum held shortly after ratified the move, with 90% of voters, under intense propaganda and pressure, approving the consolidation of power. The army now swore its oath not to the German state or constitution, but to Adolf Hitler personally. Within just 18 months of becoming Chancellor, Hitler had transformed Germany's constitutional democracy into a totalitarian regime centered around his leadership. The Nazi state, characterized by the fusion of party and government, the suppression of dissent, and the elevation of Hitler as the infallible voice of the German people, was now fully established. The path to power that had begun with a failed putsch in a Munich beer hall had culminated in absolute rule. The stage was set for the implementation of the ideological goals laid out in Mein Kampf: racial purification, territorial expansion, and the reordering of Europe. Hitler was no longer a political outsider or agitator. He was the uncontested leader of a modern state, with all the instruments of power at his disposal. Chapter 6: Path to Power. With absolute power firmly in his grasp by mid-1934, Adolf Hitler began to reshape Germany according to the ideological principles he had long promoted. The dictatorship was no longer theoretical, it was administrative, legal, and enforced, through a combination of carefully planned policy initiatives, relentless propaganda, suppression of dissent, and appeals to national pride. Hitler set out to transform Germany into a racially unified, militarily strong, and ideologically conformist state. One of his earliest and most effective moves was to address Germany's crippling economy. Although the global Great Depression had eased slightly by 1933, unemployment in Germany still hovered near 6 million. Hitler understood that legitimacy, especially among the working class and middle class, would depend heavily on economic revival. His regime introduced a series of public works projects, the most famous of which was the construction of the Autobahn, Germany's nationwide highway system. These projects not only provided jobs but symbolized progress, order, and national rejuvenation. The government also invested heavily in housing, infrastructure, and the development of state-owned enterprises. Through the Reinhardt program and similar schemes, Germany experienced a rapid decline in unemployment and a modest rebound in industrial production. At the same time, the Nazis implemented strict wage controls, abolished independent labor unions, and replaced them with the German Labor Front, DAF, a state-run organization designed to control and indoctrinate workers. Strikes were outlawed, and collective bargaining was eliminated. Instead, workers were offered state-sponsored leisure programs through the Strength Through Joy initiative, which organized affordable vacations, concerts, and sporting events. These efforts were not intended to empower the working class, but to depoliticize it, transforming workers into loyal components of the national machine. While the economic recovery was not entirely due to Nazi policies, some improvement was already underway before 1933. The regime effectively claimed credit. Propaganda portrayed Hitler as the savior of German prosperity, the man who had brought bread, discipline, and dignity back to a broken people. This narrative became a central theme in Nazi media, which was now fully controlled by the state. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a vast campaign to align public consciousness with Nazi goals. All forms of communication, radio, newspapers, film, literature, and education were placed under ideological supervision. Radios, known as Volksempfänger, people's receivers, were distributed at low cost to ensure that Nazi messaging could reach every household. Speeches, rallies, and news bulletins were crafted not to inform, but to shape perception and generate emotional unity. Hitler himself became a carefully curated public figure. Photographs, posters, and broadcasts presented him as tireless, wise, and intimately connected to the will of the German people. He was shown visiting factories, embracing children, listening to farmers, and receiving adoration from massive crowds. The Führer cult, an idea that Hitler embodied the nation's soul and destiny, was not just imposed from above, but gradually accepted by millions of Germans who saw tangible improvements in their daily lives and were eager to believe in national renewal. Beyond economics and propaganda, Hitler intensified control over all institutions. The Gleichschaltung process, which had begun in 1933, continued to absorb or dismantle every independent organization, from professional associations to religious youth groups. Education was thoroughly revised. School textbooks were rewritten to include Nazi ideology, emphasizing racial hierarchy, German military history, and loyalty to the Führer. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League and to swear allegiance to Hitler. Young people were a primary focus of Nazi indoctrination. Boys were enrolled in the Hitler Youth, which combined physical training, political education, and military preparation. Girls were placed in the League of German Girls, where they were taught domestic skills, obedience, and the importance of motherhood in the service of the state. The goal was to shape German youth into future soldiers and mothers of a racially pure nation. Religion was another area of control. While Hitler initially promised to respect Christianity, his regime gradually sought to subordinate religious institutions to the state. The German Christian movement, a Nazi-influenced faction within Protestant churches, promoted a version of Christianity compatible with Nazi ideology, one that rejected the Old Testament and emphasized racial purity. Catholic institutions were similarly pressured through surveillance, arrests, and propaganda, though the 1933 Concordat with the Vatican provided temporary protection. Over time, however, the regime marginalized religious influence in public life, encouraging a secular, nationalistic worldview centered on blood, soil, and destiny. At the heart of Nazi governance was repression. The Gestapo, or secret state police, became the primary instrument for identifying and eliminating opposition. Operating without judicial oversight, the Gestapo had the authority to arrest individuals on suspicion alone. Informants were everywhere. Neighbors, co-workers, even family members, and fear permeated society. Political dissidents, Jehovah's Witnesses, trade unionists, and anyone suspected of anti-Nazi behavior could be sent to concentration camps, which were expanding across Germany. While early camps like Dachau were originally used for political prisoners, by 1935 they increasingly held those considered racially or socially undesirable. Jews, Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals, and others were subjected to brutal treatment, forced labor, and in some cases, death. The legal system, too, was subordinated to Nazi ideology. Special courts were established to try political offenses, and judges were required to interpret laws in accordance with the Führer's will. The People's Court, founded in 1934, became notorious for its show trials and harsh sentences. Defense rights were minimal, and verdicts were often predetermined. In this legal environment, justice was not blind but ideologically guided. Although the Nazi state appeared orderly and efficient from the outside, it was characterized internally by competing bureaucracies, overlapping responsibilities, and a constant need to prove loyalty. This chaotic structure was intentional. Hitler believed in setting individuals and institutions against each other to prevent any one group from gaining independent power. He rarely gave direct orders in writing, preferring instead to express general wishes, which subordinates then interpreted and carried out in increasingly radical ways. This governing style encouraged fanaticism and competition in service to the Führer's vision. By 1936, the transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state was effectively complete. The foundations of the Nazi regime, economic revival, ideological conformity, racial hierarchy, and centralized control had been laid. While many Germans were not active Nazis, large portions of the population had become either passive supporters or silent bystanders. The visible improvements in employment and national pride masked the growing brutality, repression, and preparation for future aggression. The illusion of peace and order was carefully maintained, but beneath the surface, the machinery of dictatorship was fully operational. Hitler had not only rebuilt the German state, he had refashioned it in his own image. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler had completed the internal transformation of Germany into a tightly controlled, ideologically uniform dictatorship. With dissent suppressed, propaganda flourishing, and the economy showing signs of controlled growth, his attention turned increasingly to foreign policy and rearmament, areas he had long regarded as central to Germany's national resurrection. From the earliest pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler had laid out his vision for territorial expansion and the overturning of the post-World War I international order. Now, as Führer of a powerful state, he was ready to asset. The heart of his foreign policy agenda was the systematic dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles, which he viewed as a national humiliation. The treaty had imposed strict limitations on Germany's armed forces, prohibited the possession of offensive weapons like tanks and aircraft, and demilitarized key regions such as the Rhineland. It also forbade union with Austria and stripped Germany of overseas colonies. For Hitler, these conditions were not only unfair, they were unnatural and intolerable. He believed that Germany's future depended on restoring military strength, regaining lost territories, and expanding eastward for Lebensraum, living space, at the expense of Slavic populations. In March 1935, Hitler took his first bold step by openly announcing the reintroduction of conscription, in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The German army, previously limited to 100,000 men, would now be expanded to 550,000. Simultaneously, plans were underway to develop a modern air force, the Luftwaffe, and increase the production of tanks, artillery, and submarines. These moves were met with concern in Britain and France, but no military action was taken. Instead, the Western powers issued formal protests while continuing to pursue a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another war. Hitler interpreted this caution as weakness and took it as a green light to press further. In March 1936, he ordered the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a region along the French border that had been demilitarized under Versailles to provide a buffer zone. German troops marched in without resistance. Though the move was risky, Hitler had privately acknowledged that a French military response could have forced a retreat. No such response came. The French government, politically divided and cautious, chose not to act without British support. Britain, still recovering from World War I, had little appetite for confrontation. The success of the Rhineland operation marked a turning point. It emboldened Hitler and significantly enhanced his domestic standing. German newspapers hailed the move as a triumph of national will, and public enthusiasm surged. The international community's inaction reinforced Hitler's belief that Germany could revise the post-war order through bold action and calculated risk. At home, rearmament became a central pillar of policy. It served both ideological and economic purposes. Militarization reduced unemployment, stimulated industry, and created a sense of unity and purpose. Youth were drawn into pre-military organizations, workers were redirected toward arms production, and scientists were tasked with advancing military technology. The Nazi regime portrayed these developments as purely defensive, but in reality, they were part of a broader strategy of regional domination. Hitler's ambitions were not confined to Germany's borders. He envisioned the creation of a greater German Reich, incorporating all German-speaking peoples and ultimately stretching deep into Eastern Europe. The first major step toward this goal was the Anschluss, or union with Austria. Despite the Versailles and Saint-Germain treaties explicitly forbidding such a union, Hitler was determined to annex Austria, his birthplace, and incorporate it into the Reich. He believed that most Austrians supported unification and that opposition could be overcome by intimidation and propaganda. In early 1938, he increased pressure on Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, demanding the legalization of Austrian Nazis and greater political alignment with Germany. When Schuschnigg resisted, Hitler escalated the crisis. On March 11, 1938, under the threat of invasion, Schuschnigg resigned, and German troops crossed the border the next day. The Anschluss was executed swiftly and without military resistance. German forces were greeted by cheering crowds in Vienna and other cities, though the public enthusiasm was not universal and was amplified by propaganda. Within weeks, Austria was fully absorbed into the Reich and renamed Ostmark. The Nazi regime moved quickly to suppress dissent, arrest Jewish citizens, and impose anti-Semitic laws. The annexation was yet another flagrant violation of international treaties, but again, the Western powers failed to respond with more than verbal protest. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and other leaders hoped that satisfying Hitler's territorial ambitions would preserve peace. Hitler interpreted their inaction as a signal that further expansion might also go unchallenged. With Austria now part of the Reich, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, a new state created after World War I, one that included a significant ethnic German population in the Sudetenland region. Nazi propaganda accused the Czechoslovak government of mistreating Germans, inflaming tensions and laying the groundwork for intervention. Hitler framed his demands as a matter of national self-determination, insisting that Sudeten Germans had the right to rejoin the Reich. As tensions escalated, Britain and France once again chose diplomacy over confrontation. In September 1938, Hitler met with Chamberlain, French Premier Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in Munich. The resulting Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further territorial demands. Czechoslovakia, not invited to the negotiations, was forced to comply. The Munich Agreement was hailed in Britain as a triumph of diplomacy. Chamberlain famously returned home declaring peace for our time. But in Germany, it was seen as another victory for Hitler's strategy of pressure and brinkmanship. The annexation of the Sudetenland gave Germany valuable military fortifications, natural resources, and a new strategic position in Central Europe. More importantly, it signaled that the Western democracies were unwilling to confront German expansion directly. Hitler's popularity in Germany reached new heights. He was portrayed not only as the builder of highways and restorer of pride, but now as the diplomat who had secured national goals without war. In public speeches, he emphasized his desire for peace while continuing to prepare for war behind the scenes. Hitler's foreign policy during this period was marked by a careful balance of aggression and timing. He pursued expansion incrementally, choosing targets that could be justified by ethnicity or history, and avoiding direct confrontation until the balance of power favored Germany. Each success made the next move easier, while increasing the regime's confidence and the military's readiness. By the end of 1938, Hitler had not only restored Germany's military strength and broken the most restrictive clauses of the Versailles Treaty, he had also expanded its borders without firing a single shot. The illusion of peace still held, but the foundations for a global conflict had been laid. Hitler's vision of a greater Reich, cleansed of internal enemies and dominant over Europe, was no longer rhetoric. It was becoming reality. The world, still hesitant to believe in the full scope of his ambitions, stood on the brink of catastrophe. While Adolf Hitler's foreign policy victories in the mid to late 1930s boosted his standing both at home and abroad, they were accompanied by a growing radicalization of domestic policies, particularly regarding the regime's treatment of Jews and other so-called undesirable elements. Although anti-Semitism had been a core component of Nazi ideology from the beginning, the pace and intensity of its implementation changed significantly after Hitler had consolidated power and felt emboldened by the inaction of foreign governments. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws had legally codified racial discrimination in Germany. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship, prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and introduced the classification of people based on ancestry rather than religious practice. Under the Nuremberg system, even people who did not identify as Jewish but had Jewish grandparents were subject to persecution. These laws institutionalized anti-Semitism and laid the groundwork for what would become a systematic campaign of exclusion, dispossession, and ultimately annihilation. In the years following, Jews were progressively pushed out of public life. They were banned from civil service, the legal profession, the media, and education. Their businesses were boycotted or forcibly Aryanized, sold under pressure at far below market value to non-Jewish Germans. Jewish children were expelled from public schools, and cultural institutions were purged of Jewish influence. The propaganda machine constantly vilified Jews as corrupt, dangerous, and subhuman. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda flooded the airwaves and press with anti-Semitic imagery and narratives, blaming Jews for Germany's economic hardships, moral decline, and international isolation. While this campaign had been escalating for years, the turning point came in November 1938 with the Kristallnacht pogrom, also known as the Night of Broken Glass. The immediate pretext for the violence was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Polish-Jewish teenager. In response, Nazi leaders organized and encouraged a coordinated wave of violence across Germany and Austria. Over the course of 2 nights, hundreds of synagogues were burned, thousands of Jewish-owned shops were looted and destroyed, and Jewish homes were ransacked. Police were ordered not to intervene. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, including Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Dozens were killed either outright or through mistreatment in custody. The economic and emotional devastation was immense. Kristallnacht was not merely a spontaneous outburst of violence. It was a state-sanctioned act of terror designed to push German Jews out of society entirely. The international response to Kristallnacht was one of condemnation, but no concrete action was taken. Western nations expressed outrage, but none opened their borders meaningfully to Jewish refugees. Hitler interpreted this passivity as confirmation that his internal policies would not provoke serious external opposition. From that point on, Jewish life in Germany became increasingly untenable. Emigration was encouraged, often with heavy financial penalties, but few safe destinations remained. Many countries, including the United States and Britain, maintained restrictive immigration quotas. For the Nazi regime, this reinforced the idea that the Jewish question would require more radical solutions. Parallel to the intensification of anti-Semitic policy, Hitler's government accelerated preparations for war. Despite his public claims of seeking peace, the regime was actively building a modern war machine. German industry was reorganized to support armament production, and military spending skyrocketed. The Luftwaffe expanded its fleet, the Wehrmacht grew in numbers and capability, and new tanks and artillery were produced in large quantities. Military exercises were conducted more openly, and Hitler frequently visited factories and military sites to showcase Germany's strength. While much of the population welcomed the return of national pride and jobs, the regime's ultimate aims were far more aggressive than mere rearmament. The next target was Poland. Following the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, Hitler demanded the return of Danzig, a semi-autonomous city under League of Nations protection, and a corridor across Polish territory to connect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. These demands were unacceptable to the Polish government, which had received security guarantees from Britain and France. Hitler, however, was undeterred. He believed that the Western powers would once again back down, as they had during the Rhineland and Czechoslovakia crises. But there was one key obstacle to immediate invasion: the risk of a two-front war. To avoid this, Hitler pursued a surprising diplomatic initiative with his ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned, with the Soviets taking the eastern half and the Germans the west. For Hitler, the pact was a masterstroke. It neutralized the threat of Soviet resistance, ensured a free hand in Poland, and isolated Britain and France diplomatically. For Stalin, the pact bought time to rebuild the Red Army and recover from internal purges, while allowing territorial gains in Eastern Europe. With the Soviet Union now temporarily neutralized, Hitler set the final plans for war into motion. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, using a combination of blitzkrieg tactics, rapid tank assaults, airstrikes, and encirclements to overwhelm Polish defenses. The campaign was brutal and swift. Cities were bombed, civilians targeted, and resistance crushed within weeks. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later, fulfilling their treaty obligations to Poland. World War II had begun. For Hitler, the war was not just about borders. It was the beginning of a grand ideological struggle. He saw it as an opportunity to reshape Europe, destroy his enemies, and fulfill the racial and geopolitical ambitions laid out in Mein Kampf. In speeches to military leaders, he described the coming war as one of annihilation, especially in the East, where he planned to create a German empire built on the ruins of Slavic states and the elimination of Jews and Bolsheviks. By the end of 1939, Hitler had transformed Germany into a highly mobilized, militarized, and radicalized state. The Nazi regime was no longer simply repressing dissent or preparing for conflict. It was now actively engaged in war and genocide. The illusion of limited goals and defensive policy was gone. What remained was a totalitarian system driven by ideology, expanding by force, and preparing to plunge the world into a catastrophe unlike any seen before. The path from the beer halls of Munich to the fields of Poland had been paved step by step, through propaganda, legislation, terror, and diplomacy. Hitler had built his Reich. Now he intended to expand it, no matter the cost. Chapter 7: The Führer State. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Adolf Hitler's dictatorship had evolved into what scholars would later term the Führer State, a uniquely personalized form of totalitarian rule where all power, decision-making, and loyalty flowed directly to and from one man. While most modern governments operated through institutions, legal frameworks, and collective authority, the Nazi state was structured around a single individual whose word had become law, even when never written down. This centralization of power was not accidental. It was the deliberate outcome of years of consolidation, terror, propaganda, and ideological reshaping. The formal architecture of the Third Reich retained some of the superficial features of a state: ministries, parliaments, courts, and administrative offices. But in practice, these were often hollow institutions, subordinated to Nazi ideology and, ultimately, to Hitler's will. The Reichstag, once Germany's parliament, no longer had any real legislative function. After the passage of the Enabling Act in 1933, it met rarely and only to unanimously approve whatever Hitler declared. Independent courts continued to exist, but Nazi judges ensured that verdicts aligned with party policy. Legal definitions were vague and increasingly based on racial or ideological criteria rather than objective law. Hitler himself disliked bureaucratic detail and rarely issued direct orders in traditional formats. Instead, he ruled through a mixture of speeches, personal conversations, and expressions of the Führer's will, which subordinates would then interpret and execute, often in radical and competing ways. This intentionally chaotic governance model created overlapping authorities, encouraged rivalry among Nazi leaders, and left final responsibility ambiguous. It also guaranteed that ambitious officials would constantly attempt to anticipate and fulfill what they believed Hitler wanted, leading to increasingly extreme policies. At the top of this hierarchy stood a select group of loyal figures, each with their own domains of influence. Heinrich Himmler, as head of the SS and the Gestapo, oversaw security, policing, intelligence, and eventually the vast network of concentration and extermination camps. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, controlled all cultural, artistic, and media output, shaping public perception through film, radio, press, and mass events. Hermann Göring, Hitler's early protege, held a variety of roles, including commander of the Luftwaffe and overseer of the four-year plan, which aimed to prepare the economy for total war. Other figures like Albert Speer, armaments, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, and Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer, each carved out spheres of authority based largely on proximity to Hitler rather than institutional clarity. This created a state that was both omnipresent and disorderly. Gleichschaltung, or coordination, had ensured that every organization in German public life, from teachers' unions to chess clubs, had been Nazified. But within the upper levels of power, competition and confusion were the norm. Ministries overlapped with party offices, SS departments duplicated police functions, and local Gauleiters, regional Nazi leaders, often acted as semi-independent rulers. Hitler fostered this environment intentionally. He believed that competition bred loyalty, that ambition would push subordinates to outdo each other in serving the regime's goals. He avoided cabinet meetings and rarely delegated full authority. Instead, he allowed his lieutenants to fight among themselves, ensuring that no single official became indispensable or too powerful. At the same time, this system reinforced the cult of personality that had elevated Hitler from a political outsider to the unchallenged leader of a nation at war. His image was everywhere, on walls, in school books, on currency, in songs, and on radio broadcasts. The Nazi salute was accompanied by cries of "Heil Hitler," not as a formal requirement alone, but as a daily act of allegiance. Children wrote essays about the Führer's greatness, women sent letters to him seeking advice or favors, and military officers swore personal oaths of loyalty not to Germany or the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. This culture of devotion was cultivated carefully. While secret police and propaganda maintained obedience, the regime also provided a sense of purpose to many Germans. National pride had been restored, unemployment reduced, and perceived enemies silenced. Hitler was not just feared, he was admired, even revered, by millions who saw him as the embodiment of Germany's rebirth. Public spectacles reinforced this image. The Nuremberg rallies, held annually until the war began, featured vast assemblies of uniformed Nazis, torchlit processions, choreographed speeches, and massive banners. These events were filmed, broadcast, and used to create a visual and emotional experience that transcended ordinary politics. Hitler's speeches were often presented as moments of prophetic clarity, as if history itself were speaking through him. The role of ideology within the Führer state cannot be understated. Nazism was not a fully coherent political philosophy in the academic sense, but it provided a worldview centered on race, struggle, hierarchy, and destiny. It divided humanity into categories of value and danger. Germans, particularly Aryan Germans, were the master race, destined to lead. Jews were the eternal enemy, blamed for communism, capitalism, moral decline, and cultural decay. Slavs were portrayed as inferior, fit only for servitude or displacement. Disabled people, homosexuals, Roma, and other groups were similarly marginalized or targeted for elimination. These ideas were not hidden or restricted to elite circles. They were taught in schools, printed in newspapers, and embedded in policy. The Führer state fused racial ideology with statecraft. Administrative decisions were often made on racial grounds. Welfare, housing, employment, and access to education were increasingly filtered through racial criteria. The Nazi slogan, "the common good before the individual good," reinforced the idea that the state's needs, and by extension Hitler's vision, overrode all personal interests. In such a system, there was no neutral ground. Ordinary citizens were drawn into the mechanisms of control. Participation in party organizations became a requirement for career advancement. Informants were encouraged. Denunciation of neighbors or colleagues was common, and the lines between citizen, enforcer, and victim were often blurred. Those who did not actively support the regime learned to stay silent or outwardly conform. Resistance existed, but it was isolated, dangerous, and often fatal. By the late 1930s, the Führer state had become more than just a political regime. It was a total worldview imposed on society with terrifying effectiveness. Its institutions functioned not to mediate power, but to execute it. Its laws existed not to protect citizens, but to define enemies. Its leaders were not public servants, but extensions of the Führer's will. And its people, willingly or under pressure, were drawn into a national project whose consequences would soon reach every corner of Europe and the world. Daily life in Nazi Germany was shaped by an all-encompassing system that left few aspects of personal experience untouched. From childhood to old age, from schoolrooms to workplaces, from theaters to kitchens, the regime sought to mold how Germans thought, spoke, worked, believed, and even felt. The goal was not merely to maintain political control, but to fundamentally transform German society into an ideologically unified body, loyal to the Führer, obedient to the state, and aligned with the racial and cultural ideals of National Socialism. Nowhere was this process more intense than in education and youth programs. The Nazi regime viewed the minds and bodies of children as raw material to be shaped into instruments of the future Reich. School curricula were revised across all subjects to reflect party ideology. History classes focused on German military victories, national humiliation after World War I, and the betrayal of the Versailles Treaty. Biology emphasized racial theory, eugenics, and the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Geography illustrated Germany's need for Lebensraum in the East. Physical education was expanded significantly, with an emphasis on strength, discipline, and endurance preparation for future military service. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, and those deemed politically unreliable or racially unfit were dismissed. Loyalty to Hitler was demanded, and students were taught to see the Führer as a paternal figure. School days often began with the Nazi salute and patriotic songs. At the same time, the classroom was only one component of a broader program of indoctrination. The Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend, Four Boys, and the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel. For girls became mandatory by the mid-1930s. These organizations extended education into evenings, weekends, and holidays. Boys were trained in military skills, map reading, marching, and Nazi ideology. Girls were prepared for their future roles as wives and mothers, receiving instruction in home economics, physical fitness, and racial doctrine. Youth camps, parades, and community service projects fostered camaraderie, loyalty, and a sense of mission. By drawing children away from traditional institutions, such as church youth groups, scout organizations, or family authority, the The regime cultivated a generation that would see itself first and foremost as belonging to the National Socialist state. Culture in Nazi Germany was also subject to intense control. The regime promoted a narrow definition of what was acceptable in art, music, literature, and theater. Works that did not conform to Nazi ideology were banned or destroyed, while approved art was used to reinforce state narratives. Modernist, abstract, and expressionist art were condemned as degenerate and Tartik Kunst, especially if the artists were Jewish or politically leftist. Museums were purged, and special exhibitions were held to ridicule non-approved styles. In their place, Nazi cultural institutions promoted classical, realistic, and heroic themes, landscapes, peasant life, militarism, and idealized Aryan forms. In music, German composers like Wagner and Beethoven were celebrated for their supposed alignment with Germanic spirit, while jazz, swing, and anything associated with African American or Jewish culture was banned. Literature followed similar lines. Books by Jewish authors, pacifists, or critics of the regime were burned in public ceremonies, the most infamous occurring in May 1933 when thousands of volumes were set aflame in Berlin and other cities. Approved literature glorified German history, nationalism, sacrifice, and anti-Semitic narratives. The press, radio, and film were coordinated by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, which ensured that all cultural products served the ideological and emotional goals of the state. Films like Triumph of the Will and The Eternal Jew were designed to stir nationalist pride and reinforce racial hatred. Entertainment was allowed, but it had to be ideologically safe. Even comedies or romances subtly reinforced conformity, obedience, or traditional gender roles. The regime also reshaped the role of women in society. Contrary to some modernizing trends of the Weimar era, the Nazis promoted a highly traditional patriarchal model. Women were celebrated as bearers of the race, mothers of future soldiers, and moral guardians of the household. The slogan Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, summed up the official expectation for female life. Laws and propaganda encouraged women to marry early and have many children. Financial incentives, such as the Mother's Cross, a medal awarded for producing 4 or more racially pure children, were used to promote fertility among Aryan women. At the same time, women were discouraged and often barred from higher education, professional careers, and political life. Female participation in government and leadership roles was nearly non-existent. The only acceptable public visibility for women was as mothers, nurses, or organizers of family life. This idealization of womanhood, however, was inseparably tied to race. Jewish women, Roma women, and others deemed inferior were excluded entirely from these roles. They were increasingly marginalized, sterilized, or subjected to violence. The Nazi regime also maintained an elaborate system of social control and surveillance. The Gestapo, secret state police, operated a vast network of informants who monitored neighborhoods, workplaces, and even families for signs of dissent or deviance. A careless joke, a critical comment, or failure to salute could lead to arrest or interrogation. While not every German lived in constant fear, the awareness that the state was watching created an atmosphere of caution and silence. Conformity became both a survival strategy and a social norm. Yet it would be misleading to see all obedience as driven purely by fear. Many Germans genuinely supported the regime, whether due to economic recovery, national pride, or shared ideology. Others, while uncomfortable with some aspects of Nazi policy, found reasons to justify their silence or participation. The benefits of compliance, employment, security, inclusion were real, especially when contrasted with the isolation and danger faced by those who resisted. The regime used welfare and rewards to encourage loyalty. Programs like the Volkswagen Savings Scheme, Strength through Joy Vacations, and access to affordable goods were presented as evidence that the Nazi state cared for its people. These benefits, however, were generally reserved for those who met racial and ideological criteria. Those deemed outsiders, Jews, political dissidents, disabled individuals, were excluded or targeted. Thus, daily life in Nazi Germany was a complex mixture of public conformity, private compromise, and moral erosion. Citizens navigated a system where ideological correctness replaced legal certainty, where propaganda shaped perception more than truth, and where loyalty was rewarded while dissent was punished. It was a society where ordinary routines, going to school, attending the theater, listening to the radio, were embedded in a larger framework of control and mobilization. Life continued. Children played, families gathered, workers went to their jobs. But behind the surface of normalcy was a state that had claimed not only the instruments of power but the hearts, minds, and habits of an entire nation. The totalitarian reach of Hitler's regime had succeeded not only in silencing opposition but in redefining what it meant to be German. The totalitarian structure of the Nazi state was not only about consolidating political power or managing society through propaganda and surveillance. At its core, it was built upon a radical and violent racial ideology, a belief system that classified human beings into hierarchies of value and saw some lives as inherently worthy, while others were marked for exclusion, exploitation, or extermination. This ideology had been present in the Nazi program from the beginning, but after Hitler's rise to total power, it was applied with increasing thoroughness and brutality. The Nazi worldview divided people primarily by race. The so-called Aryan race, often vaguely defined as tall, blonde, blue-eyed Germans of Northern European descent, was seen as the master race, destined to rule. At the bottom of this racial hierarchy were Jews, portrayed not just as a separate people but as a dangerous biological threat to German purity, national strength, and Western civilization itself. Jews were described as parasites, conspirators, and corruptors of culture, economy, and politics. These ideas were not fringe views, they were mainstream within Nazi discourse, taught in schools, promoted through media, and reinforced by law. As early as 1933, the Nazi regime had begun passing laws to exclude Jews from civil service, law, education, and the arts. Over the following years, these restrictions widened to include economic exclusion, Jewish businesses were boycotted, and Aryanization efforts forced Jewish owners to sell their enterprises, often at deep losses, to non-Jewish Germans. Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors were stripped of licenses. Jews were barred from public parks, swimming pools, and theaters. By 1938, these efforts had escalated into outright violence, culminating in Kristallnacht, the state-orchestrated pogrom that destroyed synagogues and Jewish shops across Germany and Austria. After Kristallnacht, a turning point was reached. The regime no longer pretended that Jews could remain within German society under harsh conditions. Instead, forced emigration became official policy. Jews were encouraged, or rather coerced, to leave the country, often required to pay exorbitant flight taxes and forfeit most of their property. However, as anti-Semitic policies intensified, the number of countries willing to accept Jewish refugees dwindled. Conferences such as the Evian Conference in 1938 highlighted the international community's unwillingness to provide refuge in any meaningful way. As borders closed and escape became more difficult, Nazi leaders began to consider more final solutions to what they called the Jewish question. Jews were not the only group targeted under Nazi racial doctrine. Roma and Sinti communities, collectively known as Gypsies, were also classified as racially inferior. Like the Jews, they were subjected to surveillance, registration, exclusion from schools and workplaces, and ultimately incarceration in camps. In 1936, the Marzahn camp was established near Berlin for Roma, and similar facilities were built across the Reich. Nazi racial science labeled Roma as asocial and criminal by nature, and proposals to sterilize or eliminate them gained increasing support. A parallel campaign was waged against people with disabilities under the regime's eugenic ideology. Hitler and his advisors believed that those with hereditary illnesses, mental impairments, or physical deformities weakened the racial health of the German Volk. Beginning in 1933, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring mandated forced sterilizations. Over 400,000 people were sterilized under this law in the following years, many against their will, in clinics and hospitals throughout Germany. By 1939, the regime had moved beyond sterilization to murder. Under the code name Action T4, a secret euthanasia program was launched, targeting disabled infants, children, and adults. Doctors, nurses, and bureaucrats were instructed to identify patients deemed life unworthy of life. These individuals were transferred to special killing centers, such as Hadamar, Grafenegg, and Brandenburg, where they were gassed, injected, or starved to death. Amylies were often sent forged death certificates listing pneumonia or heart failure as the cause. Although the program was officially halted in 1941 due to public protests, particularly from some clergy, it continued in secret until the end of the war. Action T4 was a crucial precursor to the later extermination of Jews and others in death camps. Many of the same personnel, methods, and institutions were carried over into the Holocaust. The Nazi regime also persecuted homosexuals who were seen as a threat to the reproduction and moral health of the German people. Paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, which criminalized homosexual acts between men, was aggressively enforced. Thousands were arrested, imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps, where they were forced to wear pink triangles and subjected to brutal treatment, medical experiments, and often death. While lesbians were not persecuted as systematically, they too faced discrimination and social pressure to conform to state-imposed gender roles. Jehovah's Witnesses, known for their refusal to salute Hitler or serve in the military, were another target. Though small in number, they were viewed as dangerous for their unwavering religious commitment, which was seen as incompatible with absolute loyalty to the Führer. Many were arrested, and thousands were sent to concentration camps, where they were identifiable by purple triangles. Some were executed for refusing military service, even when offered release in exchange for renouncing their faith. The machinery of persecution in Nazi Germany was vast, and it required the cooperation of countless ordinary citizens, civil servants, police officers, teachers, doctors, and neighbors. While many Germans did not participate directly in acts of violence, the system relied heavily on public complicity and silence. Denunciation became a routine part of social life, and individuals learned quickly what could or could not be said, who was vulnerable, and how to protect themselves or benefit from others' misfortunes. At the same time, the concentration camp system expanded. Originally used for political prisoners and regime critics, camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen evolved into complex institutions of punishment, forced labor, and mass murder. Conditions were horrific. Starvation diets, brutal punishments, disease, and executions were common. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, oversaw the entire camp network, and by the end of the 1930s, camps had become a central feature of Nazi control. Life inside the camps was marked by terror, but also by the regime's attempt to dehumanize prisoners entirely. Identification by colored triangles for Jews, communists, homosexuals, Roma, etc., shaved heads, numbered uniforms, and arbitrary violence stripped individuals of identity and dignity. Inmates were forced to perform meaningless or exhausting labor, often for German corporations or military supply chains. As war approached, the infrastructure, personnel, and ideology behind these camps would evolve into the machinery of genocide. The Führer state at this stage had become not just a dictatorship, but a system of institutionalized cruelty, organized around a fanatical belief in racial hierarchy and national purification. What had begun as exclusion from civil life had progressed to sterilization, internment, and murder. The concept of the enemy was no longer political. It was biological, moral, and existential. For Hitler and his followers, the future of Germany depended not just on defeating external adversaries, but on removing internal ones permanently. The coming years would take these policies to their logical and catastrophic conclusion. Chapter 8, World War II begins. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 marked the beginning of the most devastating and expansive conflict in human history, a war that Adolf Hitler had long prepared for, both ideologically and militarily. The immediate catalyst was Germany's invasion of Poland, but the underlying causes lay in Hitler's broader vision for Europe, a vision driven by racial ideology, territorial ambition, and the belief in violent struggle as the engine of history. For Hitler, war was not simply a tool of statecraft. It was an existential necessity. He believed that only through conquest and expansion could Germany secure its future, achieve economic self-sufficiency, and fulfill its destiny as the dominant power on the continent. On September 1, 1939, following weeks of escalating tension and a carefully staged propaganda campaign, German forces launched a coordinated assault on Poland from the west. The attack was swift and brutal, employing a military strategy known as blitzkrieg or lightning war that combined fast-moving armored divisions, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming air support. The goal was to penetrate deep into enemy territory quickly, disorient and encircle opposing forces, and collapse resistance before a sustained defense could form. German tanks rolled across the Polish plains, supported by dive-bombing Stuka aircraft and motorized infantry. Civilians were not spared. Towns and cities were bombed, infrastructure was destroyed, and mass executions of Polish intelligentsia and officials began almost immediately. The German invasion was not only a military operation. It was also a campaign of terror designed to eliminate potential resistance and assert racial dominance from the outset. Just 2 days after the invasion began, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Though both nations had pledged to defend Polish sovereignty, their ability to intervene directly and effectively was limited. The so-called phony war ensued in Western Europe, marked by minimal military activity along the Franco-German border. While in the east, Poland was left to face overwhelming force alone. On September 17th, the Soviet Union, following the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland from the east. Caught between two powerful armies, the Polish military crumbled. By the end of the month, Poland had been effectively partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The conquest of Poland was swift, completed in less than 5 weeks, but its implications were profound. It signaled the beginning of a new kind of warfare, total, ideologically driven, and unconstrained by conventional rules. It also revealed Hitler's willingness to use deception, brutality, and diplomatic manipulation to achieve his goals. The invasion marked the transition from aggressive foreign policy to open, global conflict, and set the stage for further expansion in the months to come. Following the fall of Poland, Hitler quickly turned his attention westward. The next phase of the war would involve the conquest of Denmark and Norway in April 1940, followed by the massive and decisive campaign against France and the Low Countries in May and June. But even in these early months, the seeds of genocide and global upheaval were already being sown in the occupied territories. The SS and security services began implementing plans to Germanize regions, displace local populations, and eliminate Jews, intellectuals, and perceived enemies. The full machinery of the Nazi regime, its ideology, its militarism, its administrative ruthlessness, was now in motion on an international scale. Hitler had launched the war he had long envisioned, and with the world's great powers now drawn into the conflict, the consequences would prove catastrophic and far-reaching. With Poland under German and Soviet control, Adolf Hitler's military attention quickly pivoted toward consolidating the Western Front. Though Britain and France had declared war, neither had taken decisive action during the invasion of Poland. For months after the Polish campaign, a period of relative calm persisted in Western Europe, referred to by some as the Sitzkrieg or Phony War. However, Hitler viewed this interlude not as a sign of peace, but as an opportunity for preparation. He was convinced that Germany needed to strike quickly before the Allies could rearm and organize a serious counteroffensive. He also believed that bold, rapid action would demoralize opponents and lead to swift victories, repeating the model that had worked so well in Poland. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded both Denmark and Norway in a surprise operation codenamed Weserübung. Denmark fell in a matter of hours, offering no significant resistance. Norway, with its longer coastline and strategic access to the North Atlantic and Swedish iron ore shipments, presented a greater challenge. German paratroopers, naval forces, and Luftwaffe support overwhelmed Norwegian and British defenders. Within weeks, the Nazis had secured the country, installing a collaborationist regime under Vidkun Quisling. The occupation of Norway gave Germany a valuable northern flank, naval bases for U-boat operations, and a psychological advantage that demonstrated the reach and versatility of the Wehrmacht. Next came the more audacious campaign in the West. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched Fall Gelb, the invasion of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The Allies had anticipated a German assault through Belgium, as in World War I, and deployed forces accordingly. But Hitler, guided by General Erich von Manstein's plan, chose a more daring route. A massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a region wrongly assumed to be impassable to tanks. The German army bypassed the strongest Allied defenses and broke through near Sedan, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and French units in Belgium. Blitzkrieg tactics again proved decisive. German tanks advanced with stunning speed, supported by coordinated air assaults that disrupted communications and created panic. Within days, German forces reached the English Channel. The encircled Allied forces retreated to Dunkirk, where a desperate evacuation operation, Operation Dynamo, was launched. From May 26 to June 4th, hundreds of thousands of British and some French troops were rescued across the Channel by a hastily assembled fleet of naval and civilian vessels. Though the evacuation saved lives and morale in Britain, it also marked a major strategic defeat. France was left vulnerable. Germany pushed deeper into France. Paris was declared an open city and fell on June 14th. The French government collapsed, and an armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, in the very railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a gesture laden with symbolic vengeance. France was divided into two zones, the northern and western regions under direct German occupation, and the southeast governed by the Vichy regime, a collaborationist government led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Germany now controlled most of Western Europe, either through occupation or alliance. The stunning victories reinforced Hitler's belief in his own infallibility. He saw his success not only as a result of strategic brilliance, but as the fulfillment of his ideological and historical destiny. He believed that the collapse of France and the weakness of Britain proved the superiority of the German race and the inevitability of Nazi domination. Celebrations were held in Germany, and Hitler toured Paris briefly, visiting cultural landmarks. For the German people, the victories brought a wave of nationalist pride and temporary prosperity, as resources from conquered territories flowed into the Reich. But the conquests also brought with them responsibility for occupied populations, and the regime began implementing policies of repression, exploitation, and extermination on a much larger scale. As Adolf Hitler stood atop a continent largely subdued by German arms, he envisioned the next, and most ambitious, phase of his expansionist war. While Britain remained defiant across the English Channel, the Führer's gaze turned increasingly eastward. For Hitler, the conquest of the Soviet Union was not merely a geopolitical or strategic imperative. It was an ideological crusade. He believed that Germany's destiny lay in the East, where the Slavic populations, considered racially inferior, would be displaced, enslaved, or eliminated to make way for German colonists. The Lebensraum policy, living space for the German people, was at the core of his vision. The Nazi leadership viewed the Soviet Union as both a racial enemy and the seat of Jewish Bolshevik power, a poisonous combination that had to be destroyed to secure the future of the Reich. Plans for the invasion of the USSR, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, began to take shape in the summer of 1940, even before France had formally surrendered. Hitler was convinced that a swift and overwhelming attack, similar to the Blitzkrieg campaigns in the West, would bring the Soviet state to collapse within months. He dismissed Soviet industrial strength, underestimated the Red Army's resilience, and assumed that Stalin's purges had left the USSR fatally weakened. By June 1941, over 3 million German soldiers, along with troops from allied nations such as Romania, Hungary, and Italy, were positioned along a 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler's goal was clear: to destroy Soviet military capacity, seize the economic resources of Ukraine and the Caucasus, and eliminate the ideological and racial enemies that, in his mind, threatened German supremacy. But even before Barbarossa began, the Nazi regime had intensified its repressive policies in occupied territories across Europe. In Poland, the general government became a testing ground for racial policy and forced labor. Jews were herded into ghettos, most infamously in Warsaw and Lodz, where overcrowding, starvation, and disease ran rampant. Non-Jewish Poles faced mass executions, deportations, and cultural suppression. The SS, under Himmler's direction, began implementing the Germanization of select regions, removing local populations and replacing them with German settlers. In Western Europe, while occupation policies were initially less violent, resistance movements soon emerged, prompting harsh reprisals. The Gestapo and SS hunted down partisans, executed hostages, and used terror to maintain control. France's Vichy government collaborated with Nazi authorities, but even compliant regimes could not shield their populations from exploitation or repression. The Battle of Britain, which began in mid-1940, was Hitler's attempt to force the British into submission before turning fully eastward. The Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, launched a massive aerial campaign aimed at destroying the Royal Air Force, RAF, bombing military targets, and later shifting to civilian areas in the Blitz. British resilience, radar technology, and effective air defenses turned the tide. The Luftwaffe failed to gain air superiority, and Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was indefinitely postponed. Britain's survival was a major setback for Hitler and marked the first strategic failure of the war. Still, he pressed on. His obsession with defeating the USSR remained paramount. When Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22, 1941, it marked the largest military invasion in history. The German advance was initially spectacular. Soviet forces, caught off guard and poorly deployed, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, many of whom died in captivity. German columns raced toward Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the Ukrainian breadbasket in the south. The Wehrmacht captured vast swaths of territory, and many Ukrainians and Balts initially welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalinist rule. But hopes for liberation quickly turned to horror. The Nazi regime brought with it a scorched earth policy, mass executions, and the first systematic mass killings of Jews. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units composed of SS, police, and auxiliary personnel, followed the advancing German army, tasked with murdering Jews, communists, Roma, and other undesirables. In towns and villages across the occupied USSR, Jews were rounded up, forced to dig mass graves, and shot. Entire communities were exterminated in a matter of hours. These massacres, such as those at Babi Yar in Ukraine, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days, marked the transition from persecution to genocide. Unlike earlier violence, these killings were not random or sporadic. They were organized, methodical, and ideologically driven. The seeds of the Holocaust were now fully germinating. Meanwhile, Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, shortly after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Although the tripartite pact with Italy and Japan did not require Germany to join Japan's war against America unless Germany itself was attacked, Hitler's ideological hatred of the U.S., which he viewed as a racially mixed and Jewish-influenced society, combined with overconfidence in German military success, led him to declare war. This act united the major Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, into a coordinated global effort. Hitler had turned a European war into a world war, and the consequences would prove fatal. By the end of 1941, the limits of German power were beginning to show. The rapid victories of the early years had given way to the harsh realities of overextended supply lines, brutal winters, and determined resistance. The Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow, launched in December 1941, drove German forces back and shattered the illusion of Soviet collapse. Hitler, increasingly isolated in decision-making, refused to allow tactical retreats, leading to unnecessary losses. Yet despite these setbacks, he remained convinced of ultimate victory, attributing failures to subordinates or sabotage rather than flawed strategy or unrealistic goals. The Nazi state, now at war on multiple fronts, intensified its efforts at home and abroad. Forced labor was imported from across Europe to support German industry. Occupied populations were plundered for resources. Jews across the continent were being rounded up and deported to ghettos and camps. The apparatus of repression grew in scale and sophistication, feeding the belief that even total war could not justify compromise. Hitler had achieved the war he wanted, but it was no longer going according to plan. The Führer's personal vision, once a source of terrifying momentum, would now begin to reveal its catastrophic limits. Chapter 9: Collapse and Consequences. By the beginning of 1942, it was increasingly clear that the trajectory of Adolf Hitler's war was changing. What had started as a series of rapid conquests and overwhelming victories had transformed into a grinding, multi-front struggle that demanded more resources, manpower, and resilience than the Nazi regime had prepared for. The turning of the tide did not happen overnight, but through a series of setbacks, miscalculations, and mounting opposition from the Allied powers. At the same time, the internal contradictions of Hitler's leadership, his refusal to tolerate dissent, his ideological rigidity, and his unrealistic assessments of military conditions began to strain the effectiveness of the German war machine. The once confident image of the Führer started to give way to one of desperation, as defeat drew nearer. One of the most significant turning points came in the Soviet Union. Following the initial success of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, German forces had failed to capture key strategic objectives like Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Instead, they became embroiled in a prolonged and bloody conflict on the Eastern Front. In 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive aimed at securing the city of Stalingrad, both for its symbolic value, it bore Stalin's name, and for its position along the Volga River. What followed was one of the most brutal battles in history. German forces initially made progress, reducing the city to rubble through relentless bombing. But Soviet defenders, under orders to hold the city at all costs, refused to surrender. Street by street fighting dragged on for months, and as winter set in, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army. Despite desperate pleas from his generals, Hitler refused to allow a breakout or withdrawal. He insisted the army stay and fight, promising that supplies would be delivered by air, a promise the Luftwaffe was unable to fulfill. Cut off, starving, and freezing, the German troops eventually surrendered in February 1943. The loss of over 300,000 men dealt a massive blow to the Wehrmacht's prestige and manpower. The defeat at Stalingrad became a symbol of Nazi overreach and marked the beginning of the long German retreat from the east. From this point on, the Red Army would steadily push westward, reclaiming territory and driving the Germans back toward their own borders, at enormous cost in human life. On the Western Front, the Allies were also gathering strength. In 1943, British and American forces launched a successful campaign in North Africa, defeating the Axis powers there and opening the way for an invasion of southern Europe. In July 1943, they landed in Sicily, and by September, they had begun the invasion of Italy, forcing Mussolini's government to collapse. Although German troops continued to fight in Italy, the front further stretched Hitler's resources. In response, he committed elite divisions to defend Italy, delaying reinforcements elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany intensified. Cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and later Dresden were subjected to massive aerial bombardments, destroying infrastructure, industry, and civilian housing. While the bombings caused immense destruction, they also revealed Hitler's inability to protect the German homeland from attack, further weakening domestic morale. By 1944, Hitler's world was unraveling. The long-anticipated D-Day invasion occurred on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, France. The operation was vast and complex, involving thousands of ships, aircraft, and men. Despite fierce German resistance and significant casualties, the Allies were able to establish a secure beachhead and began their push inland. Within months, much of France had been liberated, and German forces were in retreat. The western and eastern fronts were now closing in on Germany. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Berlin headquarters, refused to accept the strategic reality. He issued no retreat orders, dismissed generals who suggested flexibility, and relied more heavily on his shrinking circle of loyalists. His speeches, once filled with energy and confidence, became darker, more paranoid, and increasingly divorced from military reality. At the same time, internal resistance to Hitler began to emerge within the German military. On July 20, 1944, a group of high-ranking officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The attempt failed, the bomb detonated, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. The regime's response was swift and brutal. Thousands of people were arrested, tortured, and executed, including many who had no direct involvement. The purge eliminated some of the last figures within the army who might have considered negotiating peace. Hitler's control, though increasingly irrational, was once again unchallenged from within. As defeat loomed, Hitler's world grew smaller. The promises of the Thousand-Year Reich, of expansion and racial supremacy, collapsed under the weight of mounting military failures and moral atrocities. Yet even in the face of clear collapse, Hitler refused to surrender. His leadership now prioritized symbolic last stands over practical survival, demanding that cities be defended to the last man and that German civilians accept ruin rather than capitulation. His worldview, built on struggle and destruction, did not allow for compromise. It required total victory or total annihilation, and in the end, it delivered the latter. As 1945 dawned, the final collapse of Nazi Germany became a question of time, not possibility. On every front, Hitler's forces were being overwhelmed by the superior numbers, resources, and coordination of the Allied powers. The Red Army, now massively resupplied and experienced, pushed relentlessly westward through Eastern Europe. The battles were fierce and often marked by mutual brutality. In places like Warsaw, Budapest, and Königsberg, the fighting resulted in widespread destruction and civilian casualties. Soviet troops, many of whom had witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by the Germans during their invasion years earlier, advanced with a sense of retribution. Cities that had once symbolized German expansion were now becoming ruins in the face of retreat and defeat. In the West, Allied forces pushed into Germany through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In December 1944, Hitler made one final gamble in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. A surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, it was intended to split the Allied lines and recapture the port of Antwerp. Initially, the German forces gained ground, and the weather limited Allied air support. However, the Allies regrouped, and by January 1945, the offensive had failed, costing Germany valuable tanks, troops, and time. It was the last significant German offensive of the war. Afterward, the Allies resumed their advance, crossing the Rhine River in March and driving into the German heartland. Inside Germany, the situation grew increasingly dire. Bombing raids had devastated urban centers, transportation networks were collapsing, and food and fuel shortages were widespread. Civilian life was dominated by fear, uncertainty, and the increasingly evident signs of defeat. Millions of refugees streamed westward, fleeing the approaching Soviet forces. The once proud Wehrmacht was now composed increasingly of young boys, elderly men, and wounded veterans. Despite these realities, Hitler remained in denial. He moved into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin in January 1945, choosing isolation and a final symbolic stand in the capital over any attempt at escape or negotiation. Even as the war neared its end, the Nazi regime intensified its crimes. The final solution, by now fully operational, continued with desperate urgency. As Allied forces approached the concentration and extermination camps, the SS attempted to cover up evidence of the genocide. Thousands of prisoners were forced on death marches from camps in the east toward Germany, with many dying from starvation, exhaustion, or execution along the way. Camps like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Buchenwald were liberated by Allied soldiers, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust to the world. What they found: emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, gas chambers, crematoria, shocked even the most hardened soldiers. The scale and systematic nature of the killings defied belief, and the question of how such atrocities could have occurred would haunt history forever. In Berlin, Soviet forces launched their final assault in April 1945. The Battle of Berlin was a massive, bloody confrontation involving over 2 million troops and tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. Street by street, block by block, the Red Army fought its way into the ruined city. Artillery fire reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Civilians were trapped, many caught between German resistance and Soviet firepower. Hitler, now physically frail and emotionally unstable, remained in the bunker, issuing increasingly irrational orders and shifting blame onto others. His generals, the German people, and even his closest followers. His once grand rhetoric had dissolved into fatalism and bitterness. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the bunker, alongside his longtime companion Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before. His death, though long anticipated by the Allies, marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime. In his final testament, Hitler reiterated his ideological convictions, blamed the Jews for the war, and urged Germans to continue fighting. His body was burned in the garden of the Chancellery, in accordance with his instructions, as Soviet troops closed in. Within days, Berlin had fallen. Germany officially surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, and the war in Europe was declared over on May 8, a date now commemorated as Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. With Hitler dead and his empire in ruins, the world was left to reckon with the scale of destruction. Tens of millions of people had died, including 6 million Jews and millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. Roma, Poles, disabled persons, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and countless civilians. Cities across Europe lay in rubble. Economies were shattered. Families were broken and scattered. The political map of Europe had changed forever. The United Nations was established to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. Germany was divided and occupied by Allied powers, leading to the eventual formation of East and West Germany. The Nuremberg trials, held later that year, would seek justice for the architects of Nazi terror. But even justice, when delivered, could not fully answer the deeper questions raised by Hitler's rise and fall. In the aftermath of Hitler's death and Germany's surrender, the world faced the monumental task of understanding how such devastation had occurred, and how an individual like Adolf Hitler had come to command such power. For many Germans, the war's end brought not only relief but disorientation. Cities lay in ruins, families were fractured, and for the first time in years, Nazi control over speech, thought, and movement had vanished. But the ideological residues of the regime did not disappear overnight. In many cases, survivors of the war, both victims and perpetrators, carried its legacy in silence, trauma, or denial. Hitler's image, which had once adorned walls and currency, was quickly removed. His name became taboo in many circles. Yet the memory of his rule would remain deeply etched into the consciousness of the world. Internationally, the end of the war ushered in a new geopolitical era. The Cold War emerged from the uneasy alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Germany, once the epicenter of Hitler's vision for empire, was now a divided and occupied nation. Berlin, where Hitler had spent his final days, became a focal point of this new conflict, split between East and West. Meanwhile, Nuremberg, a city once associated with Nazi rallies, hosted the trials of Nazi leaders, where crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity were prosecuted. These trials were historic not only in scope but in precedent. For the first time, heads of state and military officers were held accountable before an international court. Although Hitler himself escaped judgment through suicide, his ideology and actions were placed under forensic, legal, and historical scrutiny. Adolf Hitler's legacy is among the most deeply studied and universally condemned in modern history. His rise to power, initially achieved through legal and political means, revealed the fragility of democratic institutions in times of economic crisis and social unrest. His use of propaganda, charismatic oratory, and myth-making enabled him to cultivate a personality cult that silenced dissent and mobilized mass loyalty. Yet it was not only his rhetoric or ambition that led to catastrophe, it was the system he built and the ideology he imposed. The Nazi regime institutionalized racism, normalized violence, and erased ethical boundaries in pursuit of national purity and expansion. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany became a state where law served power, truth was subordinate to ideology, and humanity was divided into categories of worth and worthlessness. For historians, the central challenge remains how to explain Hitler without excusing him, and how to account for the complicity of those who followed him. Not only the elite figures in politics and the military, but also the many ordinary citizens who participated in or turned a blind eye to his regime's crimes. Was he a uniquely evil figure, or a symptom of larger social and historical forces? How did an advanced, culturally rich society like Germany come to embrace a politics of hatred and destruction? These questions continue to be explored in books, films, and classrooms around the world. The answers are never simple, but they remain essential for understanding both the past and the vulnerabilities of the present. Today, Hitler's name serves as a warning, a symbol of what can happen when unchecked power, intolerance, and authoritarianism are allowed to flourish. Museums, memorials, and educational institutions across the globe bear witness to the victims of his regime and to the imperative of remembrance. In Germany itself, remembrance is deeply woven into national culture, with efforts to confront history rather than erase it. From the preserved remains of concentration camps to Stolperstein embedded in sidewalks, marking the names of Holocaust victims outside their last known residences. The legacy of Hitler's era is not hidden but faced directly. This commitment reflects a global consensus that the lessons of his life and rule must never be forgotten. Adolf Hitler's story, from obscure beginnings to catastrophic rule, and ultimately to self-destruction, serves not as a tale of greatness but as a cautionary history of how ideology, fear, and ambition can combine to undermine humanity itself. He promised national revival and delivered ruin. He invoked order and brought chaos. He claimed to make history, and indeed he did, but through war, genocide, and irreversible trauma. The consequences of his choices reshaped the modern world and serve as a lasting reminder of the cost of unchecked power. Though his life ended in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, the echo of his actions endures, studied, remembered, and condemned so that they might never be repeated. Chapter 10: Legacy and Reflection. In the decades following the end of World War II, the figure of Adolf Hitler has remained a central and deeply unsettling presence in the historical consciousness of the world. His actions, policies, and the catastrophic consequences of his leadership continue to shape not only academic debate and public discourse, but also the moral framework through which modern societies understand power, ideology, and responsibility. Unlike many other historical figures, Hitler's legacy is not confined to one nation or one moment in time. Instead, it represents a universal cautionary tale of how democracy can collapse under pressure, how fear and resentment can be weaponized, and how hatred, once legitimized, can spiral into mass violence and genocide. Immediately after the war, the Allied occupation authorities and the emerging governments in post-war Europe began the complex process of denazification, a campaign to remove Nazi influence from public life, education, media, and government institutions. In West Germany, this process was inconsistent at first, shaped by Cold War pressures and the urgent need to rebuild society. In East Germany, the communist regime emphasized anti-fascism as a state ideology, often framing Nazism as a product of Western capitalism rather than German history. Over time, however, both German states developed different, though increasingly open, ways of addressing the past. After the reunification of Germany in 1990, a more unified and self-critical historical memory began to take root, emphasizing education, public memorials, and open dialogue. Internationally, the memory of Hitler and the Nazi regime has become a permanent feature of cultural and political life. In literature, film, theater, and academic study, the question of how Hitler came to power and how his ideology resonated with millions remains a subject of continuous exploration. Countless biographies, documentaries, and museum exhibits have attempted to understand his personality, motivations, and actions. Some focus on his psychology, delving into questions of mental health, childhood trauma, and personal insecurity. Others emphasize his political genius, the way he manipulated symbols, media, and public fears to consolidate power. Still others look at the broader conditions that enabled him: the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the humiliation of Versailles, and the perceived betrayal by Germany's previous leaders. One of the most important developments in the post-war decades has been the evolution of Holocaust education. What began as a fragmented and often silent memory, particularly among survivors and their families, has grown into a global commitment to remembrance. In schools across Europe, North America, and elsewhere, students learn about the rise of Nazism, the persecution of Jews and other minorities, and the machinery of genocide. Visits to Holocaust museums, survivor testimonies, and commemorative days like International Holocaust Remembrance Day have made the events of the 1930s and 1940s part of a shared moral vocabulary. Hitler, in this context, is remembered not simply as a dictator or military aggressor, but as the architect of industrial-scale human destruction. Yet even as history has condemned Hitler with overwhelming clarity, debates about how best to represent, teach, and understand his legacy continue. Scholars differ on the emphasis. Some see him as the driving force behind every major decision and atrocity, while others argue that the Nazi system was too large and complex to have depended solely on one man. Similarly, there is ongoing tension between presenting Hitler as an exceptional figure, almost uniquely evil, and understanding him as a product of historical conditions that could, under certain circumstances, repeat themselves. This tension is crucial because it informs how societies respond to contemporary threats. Authoritarianism, populism, racism, and political extremism. In Germany today, Hitler's name is not used lightly. There are no statues honoring him, no public buildings bearing his name, and it is illegal to promote Nazi ideology or deny the Holocaust. But this absence is not the same as forgetting. On the contrary, Germany has become a model for confronting historical guilt, not by erasing the past, but by confronting it openly. Memorials like the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, educational initiatives in former concentration camps, and the continued search for and prosecution of Nazi war criminals reflect a national commitment to remembrance. Hitler's image is treated with seriousness, not spectacle, a reminder, not a relic. Meanwhile, around the world, Hitler's legacy continues to raise questions about power, propaganda, and moral responsibility. In an age of digital misinformation, political polarization, and rising nationalist movements, the example of Hitler's rise offers important lessons. His ability to distort truth, dehumanize enemies, and transform legal institutions into tools of oppression is not merely historical trivia. It is a warning. The conditions that allowed Hitler to flourish, economic instability, social fragmentation, and loss of public trust, are not unique to any one era or country. They serve as a reminder that democracy, tolerance, and peace must be actively protected, not passively assumed. As the world moved further from the events of the Second World War, generational distance began to alter the ways in which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi era were remembered. Survivors aged, and many passed away, leaving behind written testimonies, recorded interviews, and institutions dedicated to preserving their stories. These efforts helped ensure that the memory of what happened under Hitler's rule would not fade with time. However, new challenges emerged. In the decades since the war, some groups and individuals have attempted to distort, downplay, or even deny the crimes of the Nazi regime. In response, many countries enacted laws against Holocaust denial, and educational systems placed greater emphasis on teaching historical accuracy and ethical responsibility. The phenomenon of neo-Nazism and far-right extremism, though condemned and marginalized, has continued to exist in pockets around the globe. In some cases, these groups have invoked Hitler's name or Nazi symbols not out of genuine ideological alignment, but as a provocation, a rejection of modern liberal norms, or a symbol of rebellious defiance. Still, others have tried to misappropriate parts of Hitler's image, his militarism, nationalism, or speeches, as tools for modern political messaging. These appropriations have prompted serious reflection about the ongoing relevance of Hitler's ideas, and how easily they can resurface when historical memory becomes shallow or politicized. This has led to renewed interest in understanding the mechanisms of Hitler's propaganda and influence. One key component of his strategy was the exploitation of modern media. Radio, film, newspapers, and mass rallies were all carefully orchestrated to create the illusion of national unity and to project strength. Hitler understood the power of repetition, symbolism, and spectacle. The swastika, the architecture of Nazi buildings, the carefully staged parades. All were tools to forge a collective identity centered on submission to a singular leader. In many ways, Hitler's manipulation of media foreshadowed the techniques later used by authoritarian regimes and political cults in the 20th and 21st centuries. Education has become one of the most vital defenses against this type of ideological manipulation. Across democratic societies, students are encouraged not only to learn historical facts, but to develop critical thinking, question sources, and understand the emotional and psychological tactics used by regimes like Hitler's. In Germany and elsewhere, Holocaust education is integrated with broader lessons about civic responsibility, minority rights, and the importance of democratic institutions. The goal is not only to remember the past, but to strengthen the moral and intellectual foundations of the present. In popular culture, Hitler remains a difficult and controversial figure to portray. While documentaries and historical films often approach him with sobriety and depth, other media have used satire or fiction to confront his legacy. Some creators argue that mocking Hitler robs him of power. Others worry that such portrayals risk trivializing profound historical trauma. Regardless of medium, the sheer volume of content related to Hitler underscores the extent to which his image continues to provoke thought, discomfort, and debate. His story is at once singular and universal, a study in the depths of human cruelty and the systems that enable in political discourse. Comparisons to Hitler are often made hastily, sometimes unfairly. The overuse of such analogies can dilute historical understanding and hinder thoughtful analysis. Nonetheless, the seriousness with which his example is still invoked speaks to the enduring weight of his legacy. Few figures in history are referenced so widely and with such emotional intensity across ideological lines. For some, Hitler represents the ultimate villain. For others, a cautionary metaphor. For still others, a subject of detached academic study. But in nearly every context, his name carries the charge of history and the imperative of responsibility. In the realm of psychology, Hitler has been the subject of intense scrutiny. Scholars and clinicians have explored his personality traits, narcissism, paranoia, sadism, and insecurity as potential explanations for his behavior. While these analyses can be useful, most experts agree that individual psychology alone cannot explain the scale of the Nazi regime's crimes. Hitler operated within a system that supported and amplified his worst instincts, and he relied on thousands of willing participants to carry out his vision. Understanding that system and the ordinary people within it is essential to understanding how mass violence becomes possible in any society. Perhaps the most important reflection is this: Hitler did not act alone, and the dangers he embodied are not confined to a single chapter of history. The mechanisms of authoritarianism, scapegoating, and mass mobilization are not relics. They are recurring patterns that must be recognized and resisted wherever they arise. Hitler's name, in this sense, becomes more than a biography. It becomes a signal, a warning, and a test of our capacity to remember, to learn, and to prevent such horrors from returning in new forms. As generations continue to pass and the Second World War moves further into the past, the life and legacy of Adolf Hitler remain a central focus of historical reflection, not because of admiration, but because of the extraordinary consequences of his rule. His story, with all its tragedy, violence, and manipulation, forces us to ask how such a figure could emerge, rise to power, and reshape the world with such catastrophic results. It is not only the biography of a man, but a case study in how systems can fail, how fear can override compassion, and how ideology can lead ordinary people to commit or ignore extraordinary crimes. The destruction left in Hitler's wake was not only physical, it was also moral, cultural, and psychological. Rebuilding from that destruction has taken decades, and in some ways remains an ongoing process. The importance of remembering Hitler's life lies not in the man himself, but in what his era reveals about the structures that failed to contain him. It shows the dangers of political apathy, the fragility of democratic norms, and the deadly consequences of legitimizing hatred. His story challenges us to remain vigilant, to examine the systems we live under, and to never take freedom or justice for granted. In every act of remembrance, from a school lesson to a quiet visit to a memorial, there is a quiet resistance to the forces that once allowed tyranny to thrive. Through remembrance, we do not glorify him, we guard against repetition. Through understanding, we honor those who suffered. Through truth, we protect the future. And now, as you let your thoughts settle into quiet reflection, remember that history is not only written in books, it is also preserved in the choices we make every day. Thank you for allowing this story to accompany you into rest. If you found this journey thoughtful and meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps more people discover peaceful, mindful content like this. Good night, and may we always carry the lessons of the past gently into tomorrow.